is this going to be like a debate, or are you just going to ask me questions, or how's this going to go?
I guess it'll be somewhat of a debate. You know, I know that we generally disagree on the big question here, but you know, I think, well, I actually, if you don't mind, for the benefit of like the radio audience,
Yep.
could you maybe just like tell the people out there like a little about your background? You know, are you really like a formal journalist, or as I understand it, it's more of like an activist journalist kind of role? I know you've been to Ukraine many times. I'm not sure if you're there right now, you know, like fill us in a little.
Sure. So my name is Dylan Burns. I am a war journalist and streamer. I first got interested in foreign policy when I was in high school, you know, early middle school, late middle, early high school, following the Syrian civil war day by day, mostly looking at a lot of open source information, because it was the first war where everybody was taking out their phone, recording stuff, going like, oh my God, look at that. And that information was fascinating to me. The fact that no government could control what I was seeing when it comes to this war was very, I thought, liberating to me. And I thought when it came to information, it was a revolution, and it inspired a lot of revolutions throughout the Middle East in the Arab Spring. A lot of that social media and that easy access to information that governments could not repress. And so I got a lot of interest in that. I got more interested in foreign policy, but I started working in local Maryland politics, and eventually I started a Twitch channel. And when the invasion happened, I was covering the invasion. I was talking about the invasion, and I got enough viewership. And I got enough money from when the invasion happened from people donating and liking my coverage that I thought, what's the best way to improve my coverage? There's enough people who are coming here to listen to what I have to say. And I saw that a lot of people got a lot of things wrong when it came to the war, whether it was narratives that had just been taken up and never re-examined, whether it was predictions that just were on their face completely wrong, whether it was things that people said could never happen that were happening actively, or how people described the war was going to go, which it proceeded to not go that way. So I thought that the best way to improve my coverage would not be to just like get a new studio with fancy cameras or whatever, but to go there, talk to people, and get a better understanding of what was happening on the ground. And it's been 3 years since then. Originally, I was only supposed to be there for a few weeks. It's now been 3 years. It's going to be going on 4 years. I spend about 8 months out of the year in Ukraine, usually embedded with the Ukrainian armed forces, or, you know, different aid groups, or just different people who are, you know, around the war in some way. Sometimes it'll just be civilians, and I'll talk to them about grocery prices. It just depends on what the story is. But you know, you could call it activist journalism, but my main motivation at the end of the day is that I believe it was the Washington Post editor in the 60s said this, that journalism is the first draft of history. That draft is important. You want to get the best draft possible so you can best inform people how to avoid historic tragedies again, and help people understand either their own history or, you know, the history of the conflict better. And so that's what I have a big motivation for. But it's just through doing this, I've also gained I've gained a decent amount of sympathy for the Ukrainian cause, because I think a lot of people don't know a decent amount of our history with Ukraine since the 90s and even before then.
Okay, yeah. And by the way, as an aside, I mean, you and I have a bunch of disagreements. I mean, it probably even just beyond this conflict, but I've always maintained, and I actually said this the first time we debated, which, believe it or not, was like, I just checked before the stream started. It's almost 3 years ago.
No,
like this shit flew by so quickly.
Has it been 3 years, really?
Oh, October 2022. You know, I mean, we're still a couple months out from the 3-year anniversary, I guess, but it's been a while. You know, but I've always kind of maintained, look, you know, it does take a degree of bravery to pretty much put yourself in a war zone. Mm-hmm. Even if you're not exactly on the front lines dodging bullets, you know, you're somewhat in the line of fire. Have you ever found yourself in situations over there where you felt like your life was kind of immediately in danger?
Yeah, there's been a couple of occasions. I think when I was with aid crews in Kherson after the Novokhovka Dam blew up, when we were getting shelled by Russian forces trying to get civilians out of the drowning, you know, out of the flooded home, that was pretty bad. But I don't know if I would say immediately in danger, because like the reason I felt in danger is because I was working and then I heard a whistle, then I heard an explosion, and it was very clear to me we were being shelled. But I was also not like 300 meters from the explosion, right? So it's like, it feels present, and you don't really know it's present until afterwards, like how close it was, because when you hear like a shell whistle, you don't know if it's aiming at you, if it's aimed like 500 meters away from you. So in the moment, it feels really dangerous, and it was. But also, it was my friend that ended up getting hit in the stomach. It wasn't me. Now, I was almost in the boat that he was in. I was supposed to be in that boat when he got hit in the stomach. So in and of it, so that's dangerous. But it's hard for me to like find a frame of reference, because it's like danger for you, and like, well, in a casual day, that'd probably be considered pretty dangerous for you. But for me, I don't know. I think probably more dangerous stuff would be when we fell asleep in a minefield outside of Kiev because I had a really bad Polish driver. Every time I get in trouble, it's always the Poles. I don't know why it's always the Poles, but it's always the Poles. There was also the time that I was threatened with execution by a Ukrainian soldier on the roadside after a road rage incident in the middle of the night. We had these. So I'm accredited with the military, so that means I'm allowed to be on the front line. And so when I'm embedded like on the front line and I'm taking pictures, nobody can say, "You're a spy. I know you're a spy," because I have the accreditation. They've already done like some level of background check to make sure that I'm not connected to the Kremlin, or I'm going to sell all their information. And that type of stuff has happened, and so they're very on the lookout for it. But I have the accreditation. I've done the paperwork. We're driving down the street, and there's no traffic lights at midnight because it's curfew. So there's no reason for them to waste electricity. That's really limited on that. And so we're coming this way. He's coming this way. We almost collide with this car. We're like, oh, damn, that sucks. We go off on our own way. That car swerves around, tries to drive us off a road on this bridge we're crossing in Kramatorsk, drives in front of us, stops, gets out of the car, runs up to the driver's side, cocks a gun, and then threatens to execute us both for, almost killing him while he was talking to his mother. And then my thought was, what the fuck is your mom doing on the front line? Well, why did you bring your mom? This is not a bring your mom to work day type scenario. I don't know why she's here. He then demands that my fixer who's driving the car get out of the car and like march out into the darkness in order to, apologize to his mother, which he does. I didn't know if he was going to shoot us or not. My bet was he wasn't, because I just thought he had to get it out of his system. He was angry, the war is pressuring him. He just needs to let his rage out at something. So I didn't think he was just going to like execute us both on the roadside. But I mean, I would say that's pretty dangerous. Afterwards, we found out that actually he was on his phone with his mother. So he was a distracted driver, and he wanted us. It's just wild to be on your phone with your mom, almost getting a collision, and then your response is threatened with execution. But honestly, I don't know if that was a guy that was like that before the war, after the war. But when you mobilize everyone, you mobilize everyone. And some people are not made for the front line, and they break under pressure. And I just hope when that guy breaks, he doesn't hurt anybody.
Yeah, it's, I would hope not either. It sounds like somewhat of a close call there. I mean, look, I shouldn't say obviously, but I've never been in a war zone or anything close to that. So, I can only imagine the level of danger that potentially kind of like lurks around every corner, even if you're in places that are supposedly safe. So, look, I commend you for that. And, look, I don't know, man, my objective every time, and I don't know if it always comes across this way, but every time I like engage in debates or stream or whatever, I'm really honestly, like in good faith, trying to come to some sort of like mutual understanding that is close to the truth. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't think the platform, Twitch lends to that really.
You don't think Twitch panels is like a truth finding mechanism?
Right. Yeah. And for me, I'm not even really sure why I go through with the Twitch thing, other than it's sort of like the best way to do entry level broadcasting. I mean, like I found myself on the radio now, so I have that. But, like to get into this as like a hobby, Twitch is really easy. You just turn a webcam on and you're live, and then to debate people is relatively easy. It just takes connections. So that's how I kind of got sucked into this. But I really do have like that as my intention. And so I guess my first question to you, and then we can kind of just like open up and have a back and forth, see where this goes, is like, do you think that there's such a thing as principled opposition to the U.S. support of the war?
Yeah. And when we had that debate a few weeks ago, I think you could even I give a different reaction to what I see as principled opposition, and the type of opposition that I think is like, And in that debate we've had, and it doesn't matter, we don't need to get the specifics of the debate, but I got angry at what I thought was American opposition to the war and un-American opposition to the war. And I made a big point of that. It got me very angry. And the reason why was when I was listening to one person say, well, actually, when we talk about Euromaidan, and I don't know if we need to really emphasize, you know, who got killed on the street, and let's not really talk about what happened beforehand. For me, as an American, when I think about civil liberties, when I think about freedom of expression, when I think about how a government is supposed to interact with its people, and you're saying, well, I don't want to support it because it's more complicated. And the more complicated thing is it was bad that the Ukrainian people pushed back against the government that was trying to take away their civil liberties. To me, that's un-American opposition to the war that gets me angry. I don't think it's principled. I think it's contrarian. Because I don't think if, you know, Joe Biden, and I made this point then, he said, oh, this is a whataboutism. And I don't think it is. But if Joe Biden hired like MS-13 gangs to suppress protests after he went back on a campaign promise and then proceeded to like outlaw protesting, I don't think we would get that same reaction. And so when I see myself getting caught in the weeds in like Euromaidan, Victoria Nuland coup, I feel like I'm just getting caught in an alternative media show meant to be like hyperbolic and fear catchy and like, haha, look, it's all like a conspiracy. Where I feel the more principled opposition to the war, the more American opposition to the war is we have our own problems. We have homelessness. We have drug addiction. We have high housing prices. Why are we dealing with these other countries? If these other countries want to be free, that's their business. We got to deal with our own stuff first, because if we don't deal with our own problems, we will collapse at home, and then we can help no one abroad, even if we wanted to. And to me, that's more American, because that's been here forever. Ever since the beginning of this country, there's been people who said, let's deal with our own, let's not deal with the world. Now, it's also very American that since the beginning of the country that, and I know I'm defining this weirdly in like an American, un-American way, but, you know, these are values that I care about. At the start of the United States, though, there was also foreign interventions. And so this is a debate that's been going on forever. And so when I listen to you say, I want to concentrate on these things at home, I don't want to empower the military-industrial complex, I would rather deal with America's issues at home that are affecting us. I think that'll help Americans. It's more useful for a dollar. I think that's a more principled position that I can go back and forth with as to why I think it's still worth it. But if somebody goes in here and starts talking to me about Victoria Nuland or how Yanukovych is the true rightful president of Ukraine or like the genocide of Eastern Donbass, it just feels more like Russophilia than it feels principled opposition to the war.
Yeah. Okay. So look, so I, you know, I've kind of worked myself into a position where like I've pissed everybody off, because I feel like I disagree with what I've called to this point, like the mainstream narrative about the war. You know, that we have to fund this war, fund Ukraine to protect democracy, protect, you know, Europe, protect America from tyrannical Russian imperialism and a wave of autocracy that'll crush us all, a la Hitler and Nazi Germany. I've always kind of disagreed with that narrative. But at the same time, I've never promoted this whole idea that Ukraine's sovereignty isn't real, that Ukraine is not a legitimate state, that Ukraine is only full of Nazis. You know, none of that is stuff that I believe in.
Is it only 90% then instead of 100%? Well, what's your number? Only
no, and you know, look, I've had that back and forth with people many times, and it's tough. That's why I chose to open with that question, because I've found like this has become, I mean, it's become a partisan conflict in many ways and a partisan topic, especially in the within the last year in American politics, such that, you know, if you suggest you oppose the war, you're like one of those, you know, you're one of those, I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it, you're like promoting the Russian narrative, or you're like a Trumper. And like, I'm neither of those things, but I still oppose our support or our intervention in the war. And, you know, I honestly think like, I just try to think critically about every narrative that we're fed, because so many of them are bullshit and so many of them are crafted to, you know, put on this veneer of we're doing good or this is necessary, when the truth underneath the surface is a little bit more cynical, a little bit more self-serving, etc. And that's honestly what I believe about the Ukraine war. So I'm glad you see it
can I
that.
just throw something out about that though? When it comes to like when you examine something deeper and you find a more cynical reason outside of like the PR, like this is what the State Department's telling you about freedom reason. And I agree that because sometimes I get into conversations and I feel like I'm starting from like a child's viewpoint where I come in and the first question or something is like, do you really think America's supporting Ukraine for freedom? It was like, well, do I think there's people in America to support Ukraine for freedom? Absolutely. I know many of them. Some of them are sitting Congress people, but also America's a body of like hundreds of representatives with tons of different lobby groups, with tons of different interests, with defense companies in their districts, with people taking money from defense companies, with people who have Ukrainian Americans in their district, with people who are ideologically dedicated to the idea of getting rid of corruption, people who see it as purely a national security issue, people who see it as a trade issue about maintaining trade with Europe, who's our fourth largest agricultural trading partner, one of our biggest commercial consumers for American export goods. When we're trying to rebuild American manufacturing, that's important. The prioritization of European defense priorities when they took our defense priorities into consideration post 9/11. There's a bunch of reasons, and so when I hear people like simplify it, I understand that there's more to this than like the Disney Channel version of events, right? But I also feel like sometimes people go like one layer deep into the onion and they're like, wow, I found the truth. When it's actually, oh, another layer is deep is the reason that Yanukovych was overthrown is because he hired all those thugs. Oh, well, then there's another layer. There's a lot more layers to it. And so I feel like what people do is they find out a little bit more information. They get shocked and then they stop because they like having access to that unknown truth. Because there are facts about the Ukraine war, like, for example, read the Panama Papers. Zelensky has information in there that doesn't make him look like the biggest saint in the world. But also, he's somebody who stayed back, defended his country, and he still has, I think, good moral values for having defended his nation state. So I agree that, don't just listen to the State Department, but don't just listen to the alternative media channel who's like, I found this one article that disproves everything. Now let's move on. Ukraine's just a Nazi state. I feel people want to, it's either one or the other. It's one or the other.
Okay, yeah, look, I actually totally agree with that. I think that, but I think that a lot of people, and I don't know if there's really a realistic way you and I could prevent this from happening, but I think a lot of people, they hear the prevailing narrative in the media presented in such a way that when they find some piece of evidence, as you say, like it could be one piece of evidence that contradicts that main narrative, the main narrative falls apart. And I actually think that represents like a huge problem because people lose faith in the system entirely. They lose faith in the news media. They lose faith in institutions. And look, I have lots of, I'm a communist. I have lots of criticisms of institutions and the government, all that stuff. But I do think it actually represents a big problem when people lose faith in institutions such that, well, there are times where our institutions, our media actually serve a public good, right? Like, they try to give the public pertinent, important information, and people just don't trust it outright because, the media just lies to me. When they find little bits of evidence that the media is lying, I think what might help is having meaningful, critical conversations about that overarching narrative and developing a more honest one, right? Like, so in your view, okay, like what would you say is the more nuanced take on why we should support Ukraine?
Sure. I can I separate it into like two areas because I find it easier because I've been talking about this for like so many years. I'm sorry, I switched my mic. I just realized I was using my camera mic. Does it sound better?
Yeah, a lot better.
Okay, fantastic. I'm sorry about that. And it's for the radio too. Ah, damn. Okay, so the moral side for me is actually, let's start with the America's interest side before we get into any moral side, because I feel like people either want, here's a strong moral argument, and then people think you're naive because you think it's all just about like flowers and rainbows and like, ideology and freedom, or you're a cold, calculated son of a bitch, and all you care about is like what type of mineral rights the United States is going to get out of it. Where I think that it's a complex picture, and for the people who support Ukraine, it's a variety of reasons. For America's, I think, national security interest, to use that buzzword, right? which is used so often. I think the first thing is nuclear non-deterrence. As much as everybody's talked about World War III in reference to this war, there has not been a lot of discussion about the effects of Ukraine being made to make massive concessions to an atomic power that promised that if Ukraine was to give up its atomic weapons, then it would not be aggressed upon in this exact way. And while there's, of course, the immediate threat, and I think some people underplay this, of the Ukrainians with a bunch of old nuclear scientists re-examining the idea of trying to make their weapon to protect themselves, which then makes the war even more dangerous. And the Ukrainians believe they would be in full right to do so. And it's not like they don't have atomic scientists or old material that they could use to make such sort of weapon. But I think that's a much smaller threat than the larger threat of the standard it would set, of what it would mean for any nation state that would ever pursue, like South Africa, the giving up of their atomic weapons. If you give up your atomic weapons, what message has been received? You give up your atomic weapons, you will be aggressed upon. You give up your atomic weapons, you give up the ultimate security guarantor. And while the security guarantor makes the world, with as many failure points as possible, more generally dangerous, I don't think everybody would like to see every nation state with an atomic weapon because of how many points for failure that would create in our atomic structure. But I really do fear that any tin pot dictator or terrified nation state with an aggressive expansionist neighbor would feel that the only real backdrop is to either attain atomic weapons or to never give them up, because the Ukrainians did that and what happened to them. And so I do fear that, not only for the United States, but also for the world community. Which is also why I think that the Chinese, the Indians, and many other nation states also have an interest in this war and how it ends, and how, the atomic weapon cannot be used on the battlefield for the standard it would set. It's part of the reason why I think one of the biggest motivations against Russia using an atomic weapon isn't our reaction to it, it's the Chinese reaction to it. It's the Indian reaction to it, because they're terrified of North Korea getting any ideas about the reclamation of territory used with the use of atomic weapons or the threat of their use, right? So that's one that I think, I've thought about for a while now, at least a few years. Another one is America does have interests in a stable and a competent and united Europe, not only for its own diplomatic weight, since we've been traditional allies since the end of World War II, and they have supported us in both the war on terror, which, while many times ill-advised, does show that they're willing to put blood on the line for the United States when our blood is put on the line. And they also have been willing to put out sanctions and other economic pressure on America's enemies, whatever that might mean, when we need that. And so if there's ever a time where we're trying to preserve, say, peace in the Pacific, or we need to add pressure, having the Europeans in our quarter, because we cared about their security priorities, is going to be good for the United States. And they expected as much when they sent their young boys to die in the mountains of Afghanistan. There's other security reasons. For example, if the Russians are broken in Ukraine, it's kind of hard for them to invade Moldova. It's kind of hard for them to invade Georgia again. It's kind of hard for them to invade possibly a NATO state, as Article 5 is withered more and more away by the White House in their rhetoric. And I do believe that, because they have gotten worse on Article 5 since being inaugurated, and the idea of defending certain NATO states. And so I do think that Russia being stopped in Ukraine does defend NATO better, and it means this war with NATO is less likely. Now, somebody could say, is that war inevitable? And we can have the debate later. But the point is, if Russia can invade NATO, then there's no war with NATO, which I think is pretty simple. As for the moral side of it, I think Ukraine has a right to a democracy. I think Ukraine has a right to self-sovereignty. I think that the United States putting out that there is also a strategic interest in our credibility and us looking like we're going to uphold our agreements. I think there's also an interest in us continuing to support this democracy that put its trust in us, that we told we would stand by, and not acting like a snake on the international community, which America's gotten a reputation of. Backstabbing the Kurds. Now we're getting a reputation of backstabbing the Ukrainians. This is not a good reputation for the United States to have. I would rather nation states have more trust in America as an ally than North Korea as an ally. I find that kind of humiliating for our nation. There's other stuff as well, but I don't want to drag on and give you too much to respond to.
Okay, so just on the first point, and I want to make sure I get it totally clear. So with the nuclear atomic considerations, is your argument basically that since Ukraine was kind of pressured into giving up its nuclear weapons and then they were invaded, this has now set a standard that if you give up your nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, you'll be invaded. So we should support Ukraine to prevent that.
I think we should prevent that standard being created, and I think it would send a better message to the world community that if you give up your atomic weapons for the world's security, the world will stick its neck out for you.
Okay, I mean, so I have pushback on all those points, but I'll just hit the first one. I actually think that that standard has already been set. So in terms of continuing to support Ukraine at this point, I don't see that as like a valid reason to continue funding the war effort, because it's already kind of been established that if you don't have a nuclear deterrent, you're sort of at the mercy of great powers to invade, violate your sovereignty kind of at will. And I think that that's kind of just the reality of a post-nuclear world in general. But even if you didn't want to say that's a given, I'd say that that was established with Russia invading in the first place. Us pushing Russia out doesn't change that narrative. All it means is that the only way to counteract that is another nuclear power stepping in on your behalf. I don't know what you think of that.
I disagree. That doesn't change anything, because if the way it goes is, right, if the lesson is nation state with nukes invaded, other nation states came to support them through collective defense, and the nation state that invaded ended up taking hundreds of thousands of casualties, not getting their original objectives, suffering, making their economy suffer, then the message is that this type of large-scale interstate warfare for territorial conquest, at least in the European continent, we can talk about its effects on other continents as well, because people always talk about Taiwan and such. I think that it would be solid. And I understand that the idea that since they've invaded, there's already been a statement made that there's those in the world, especially the Russians, that don't care about that sacrifice. But if the world or the United States, Europe, nation states still stand behind Ukraine, I still think that there is some strength put behind that message of you give up your atomic weapons, you trust us as security partners, and we will stick our neck out for you. Because I think that the reputation we're building when it comes to our credibility is already bad. But also I think that at the end of the day, the better Ukraine looks at the end of this, the better it will be for nuclear non-deterrence at the end of this war.
I mean, look, I really so my best evidence would be that no nuclear state has ever been invaded, and yet lots of countries have been invaded.
Russia was invaded like 8 months ago.
Yeah, okay, but other than the Kursk incursion, which not to say it's not significant at all, but I would say is sort of unprecedented. Let's put it that way, right?
Back in the late 90s.
Well, okay, I'd say the key difference with Chechnya anyway is that Chechnya was part of Russia, so I don't think they would use nuclear weapons on their own territory. And I would also argue that, I mean, depending on how you view the Russian argument about the Ukraine war,
my point was, well, I don't know. They did sign a treaty, kind of recognizing it was part of it for a bit. But my point is, like, Russia, there was a standard about atomic weapons and about being invaded. But I think there's a question about a credible nation state threatening invasion. When you make the bet on atomic weapons, you can't go back. Once you press that button, there's a standard that has been set through decades, a nuclear non-use standard that will be snapped and tested when that's used. And so I don't think that unless a nation state was really given the dilemma between national survival and rolling the dice, that they're going to be willing to make that bet. And I think that's part of the reason why when Russia was invaded, they actually downplayed it. They actually almost pretended like nothing was going on. Putin didn't say anything about it because he didn't want to create that dilemma because it was terrifying for him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, I don't find this to be really a compelling argument. I think like the universal view on the Ukraine question has always been like, well, had Ukraine not given up their nuclear weapons, maybe they wouldn't be in this mess. And I really think, countries that are in opposition to the West and view themselves as being cornered and choose to develop nuclear weapons, such as North Korea, and Iran has been supposedly developing a weapon for years and years, on again, off again. I think the idea is like, well, this is the only way to prevent a direct invasion. And I think that, if anything, the Ukraine war has kind of demonstrated that that's probably true, right? Like, Russia would have not been emboldened to do what they did if Ukraine had held on to his nukes. Do you not, or held on to its nukes? Do you not agree with that?
I do agree with that, but I also agree that the standard that we set internationally cannot be everybody should get an atomic bomb as quickly as possible, and we should just hope that everything works out. We have to find a way that if a nation state makes that sacrifice for our international security, for your and mine, and that's the reason why we didn't want Ukraine to have nukes at the end of the Cold War, was we were scared of the atomic material ending up in the hands of some terrorist organization, that some corrupt Ukrainian general or something would get traded, and before you know it, Al-Qaeda would be putting an atomic bomb in Washington, right? Or some dirty bomb or some material. This was the thing that people were scared of, was as the Soviet Union collapses, these weapons would go everywhere. And so while it is true that if Ukraine held on to those nukes, that they could have held that security, we also don't know what would have happened if all these post-Soviet states held on to the nukes. Would they have kept them all? Would they have shifted around the globe? This was the fear that the Clinton administration had, and it's why that there were people on the House floor that was literally willing to starve out the Ukrainians, saying we will cut off all the food aid, we'll do this, we'll do that, if they don't give up their atomic weapons. Now, I think, first off, it's a scoundrelous, it's the behavior of a scoundrel to take away a nation state's means to defend itself and then abandon it after saying you would come to support it. But I also think that the standard will be more shattered and harder to uphold, and it will make more nation states more eager to go get an atomic weapon if the worse Ukraine looks at the end of this. And the more it looks like nobody's going to support you if you make the sacrifice for other people's security. And that's going to be, I think, within a collective defense arrangement in Europe.
Right. So if I'm understanding this correctly, the theory would go something like, we should continue funding Ukraine's war effort until Russia is completely pushed out of Ukraine. And as a result of that, other countries in the world will sort of say to themselves, I don't need to develop a nuclear weapon, because where I would use a nuclear weapon to deter countries from invading me, now I know that America or some other power could possibly pour billions and billions of dollars and years and years and years supporting my defense.
Well, it's not it's not even necessarily the United States or there's an element of like us and keeping up our credibility. It's more about when Russia invades Ukraine, the message that is sent is that they did not care about Ukraine giving up its nuclear deterrence. The fact that it doesn't have it anymore is an opportunity to take advantage of. Yeah. But the Russians obviously did not gain all of their objectives. They failed in gaining all of their objectives. And so there is a message here of not only that you can hold up a nuclear state with non-nuclear means, you can achieve strategic objectives with non-nuclear means if you support it, but also that after 3 years of nuclear saber rattling, which I don't know if you'd agree that they were engaged in nuclear saber rattling, but I think that they were pretty openly engaging in that, it didn't really amount to anything. And so this idea of, and this is the way that Trump warns about and others warn about it, World War III, that we have to stop this because World War III is about to happen and Russia's going to blow up the world. And if we don't do anything, if we don't concede this or concede that, then Russia's going to blow up the world. And if anything, I think seceding to that, instead of trying to reinforce the standard that Ukraine tried to, not even willingly reinforce, but tried to after it was put into a corner, I think it's going to be better for the nuclear standard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason Trump and a lot of the people, sound the alarm bells about nuclear war is that, there's always the risk that a NATO state could get involved, thus triggering Article 5, which might push Putin's hand to use nuclear weapons. I think that that's the prevailing theory anyway. In terms of saber rattling, I think that a lot of that has been poured into the conversation deliberately by the Russians to sort of deter the Ukrainians from continuing to fight. So I kind of agree there. I don't know if it was a serious threat or not, but I definitely think.
Let me ask you this question. If a nation state like Russia says, I'll blow up everything if you don't give us this, and the nation state's like, okay, I'll just have to give you this then for my people and everybody else's survival, would that encourage a behavior of basically, walking into a crowded theater, pulling a pin on a grenade, holding the grenade, and saying, I'll blow up everything if you don't give me X, Y, Z? Will that encourage that behavior or discourage that behavior?
Well, I really do, and I'm not trying to nitpick. I don't love the analogy. I think that the grenade pin and all of that, like, And even nuclear war, I think it's hard to simplify this stuff, right? Like for Russia to, or any country to put themselves in a position where they're saying like, look, I'm willing to go nuclear here if I need to achieve X, Y, and Z objective. That's sort of opening themselves up to possible retaliation by a nuclear power. And I think for them to float that out there, if they were to succeed in getting whatever they wanted, I think any nation would probably still hesitate to say that because of the risk of nuclear war. You know, I think that there's already been a standard set through hundreds, thousands of years of human history that violence often gets you what you ask for. It doesn't mean that it's a good thing, and it doesn't mean that everybody will then use violence, but violence can achieve, or the threat of violence can achieve certain aims for sure.
Yeah, I think that the threat of violence can achieve certain aims. It's just, for me, the Russians have made nuclear saber rattling a big part of their diplomatic push here to both scare Westerners out of supporting Ukraine, because it's basically, do you want to trade Kiev for Washington, D.C. is the bet that they're trying to make. Like, you really got to trade these dachas you never even met, you've ever even seen for your own town, which is one bet that they were making, which just hasn't succeeded until, depending on what you think's motivating Donald Trump, until very recently. And I really wonder if this type of angling towards the Ukrainians, if we were to, at the end of this, back off and say, you know what, we're going to give you all these demands. And I'm not saying, you said earlier, we have to push the Ukrainians completely out of Ukraine. I'm not a land cultist. I think it would be better if they got all their land back, but I think we need to give the Ukrainians the best deal possible. My point isn't that if we don't push the Russians out of Crimea, we're going to create such a nuclear standard around the world that everybody's going to have to get atomic weapons. My point is, the worse Ukraine looks, the harder the lesson is, and the more eager people will be in the pursuing of atomic weapons. The stronger Ukraine's defenses at the end of this, the better they could get a deal, the best deal they can get. I think the less dire the warning would be for other states, particularly in Europe, because right now the Poles are thinking about atomic weapons. They're openly discussing atomic weapons. I see other nation states in Europe discussing atomic weapons, where the safer path would probably be nuclear arms sharing agreements with the French and the British to try to create less failure points. But tell that to the Poles.
No, look, there's no doubt in my mind. I think that's actually kind of playing into my argument, is that this can of worms has already been opened. The reality is, I think
they're talking about it, but I don't think we should say, fine, we all get atomic weapons then. That can't be I don't think that's the concession we should concede to, because if we do, how dangerous is that going to make the atomic situation on the global stage?
I'm not even saying we should concede to that. What I'm saying is that the reality is many countries have already decided, hey, it might be safer for us to have the nuclear option because of what has already occurred. I don't think you can really put the toothpaste back in the tube here and say, well, okay, we defended Ukraine and we got them. They didn't have to have an unconditional surrender. We got them some security guarantees in the negotiations for peace, and therefore you guys don't need nuclear weapons. I mean, I think hopefully we can deter lots of countries from having nuclear weapons, because we don't want a nuclear war. More countries that have nuclear weapons, the likelihood increases that we'll have a nuclear war. But
so you agree
I
that
also
this is a security priority for the United States is to have less countries with atomic weapons?
Yeah, look, I think there was a time where maybe I felt differently about that, right? That I kind of thought, okay, nuclear weapons are like the ultimate deterrent, and that if lots of great powers have them, it actually might reduce the likelihood of a conflict. Some of the Russian governments, whether it's been open or leaks through the media, some of their hinting and whatever, like things that they're saying have me a little concerned, where people are like, what, it seemed like at the start of the war, everybody was like, nuclear war, no way, it's not an option. And like a year or two in the conflict, people were like, well, maybe they could tactically nuke this. And, that scares me. And so it seems like we're more and more likely to see a nuclear war than we were 3 years ago. And more countries having nukes is a bad thing. I think we should try to deter countries from developing nuclear programs, sure.
Yeah, and I do think that the more we take in Europe's security priorities as they take into our security priorities, the more we support Ukraine, the less likely it will be that the Poles will feel a motivation that, well, if Ukraine's not going to hold, we're next. We know our historical relationship with this. And then a lot of this doesn't even need to make sense, right? Where you say, well, this nation state, because of its position, it would maybe be third or fourth in line to be invaded, even if it was invaded and it's behind this collective defense. There's historical trauma, there's history there where they'll just see the Russians touch the border, and for them, that's enough. For them, that's enough. They need to get ready because they remember what their grandpapa told them. They remember what their father told them, and now it's their turn. And so I think that the best way to prevent that is not only, I think, the Europeans figuring out a nuclear arms sharing agreement so that they can use the atomic weapons they have as a better umbrella over the continent instead of doing an arms race, but it also would require Ukraine to perform quite well and Ukraine to get the best deal that it can to make them less eager to pursue these types of weapons. And we're just talking about the European continent. This is going to have effects on other continents as well. The Taiwanese have a deep interest in how the war ends because of how they think it's going to affect them. How much it actually does depends on what IR theory you really buy into. But I think it at least would have some effect, even though sometimes it's, I think, overblown.
Yeah, well, without getting into the whole Taiwan thing, because I mean, we're still on like one point, and I do think it's actually important. But just going back to the nuclear discussion, okay, yeah, I agree that fewer countries should have nuclear weapons, thus reducing the risk of a nuclear war. But I don't really see, the argument that, okay, well, we need to continue to sustain Ukraine's defense here because that will deter, for example, Poland from developing its own nuclear weapons because they're certain that we're going to come to their aid if they're invaded.
You don't think that they would develop nuclear weapons if Ukraine fell?
I think if they're in discussions to develop them now, that they're probably going to continue those discussions regardless of what happens in Ukraine.
I mean, discussions is discussions. I mean, the majority of the South Koreans think that they should get an atomic bomb, but they haven't started because if they don't have to, or if they don't think they have to, these programs are expensive. If you want to do them right now, you can do a dirty bomb underground program that might malfunction and then you make half your city uninhabitable. You can do that. It's much cheaper. I doubt the Poles would want to do that. I doubt Eastern Europe, with their history of atomic disasters, are very eager to have another one. But that's an expensive commitment. It takes years of investment. So I think that if we can give them an out to where they don't have to make that giant purchase, where they're already spending like 4.7% GDP on defense spending, which is the highest in Europe, it's higher than us. I think they would take that out. I think the same is true for the South Koreans too.
Right. Yeah. Whether or not the discussions are far enough along that they're considering X, Y, and Z, I have no idea. But okay, let me take you at your word on all of that. I think in the case of the Poles, where they may have an interest in developing a nuclear weapon is even just based on what's happened thus far. Like, if I'm Poland, I'm looking at Russia and I'm basically saying, like, okay, even with hundreds of billions of dollars of American and European support, Ukraine still lost a significant chunk of territory. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Poland can be invaded. I don't think that would ever happen, but the Poles might feel differently. And so maybe to just add a certain layer of security here, we want to have a legitimate nuclear program to deter Russia from ever doing that. I actually think that the Poles are probably far enough along that, or far enough down that line of thinking because of what's already happened, that no amount of additional aid is going to reverse the Poles' position. So you think that
the Poles are going to get an atomic weapon then? You're saying?
No, I think that nothing we do at this point is going to change that in terms of nothing we do in Ukraine and our support of Ukraine is going to change that one way or another.
If Ukraine won the war, the Poles would still get an atomic weapon?
Well, okay, so earlier you had said that your criteria for winning the war is a more favorable.
Let's say that, okay, that was my point. I didn't mean to get into literally, but I think if the Ukrainians were able to get back Mariupol and the rest of Kherson, and they cut some deal where the Russians got whatever, but got a deal with Russians were walking away from this with, let's say, 2022 borders. Let's just, because that would be clear that they had a starting point and they're right back where they started. So that would be a failure, but Ukraine didn't get everything that they wanted, right? So we'll just use that as the standard, right? If something like that happened, or something close to that happened, I don't think the Poles would feel necessary to get an atomic weapon, especially if afterwards the Ukrainians were integrated into European defense. because the nation state that just defeated the Russians and held back the Russians with financial backing, with Europe's support, a Europe that is now talking about $800 billion of industrial military investment, which is going to take years to see. But by the time the Russians would consider doing this again, you would start to see the fruits of that labor. So I would think that there would be other pathways for the Poles to avoid having to spend a huge amount of money, not only acquiring atomic weapons, but continuously maintaining them.
I mean, look, it's sort of difficult to argue it because it's there's a lot of hypotheticals going into this, right?
Isn't this fun though? This is the hardest part of my job. It's like, okay, so if we do this, this might happen, but this might happen. And I know people who are libertarians just because they say, fuck it, I don't know what's gonna happen. I can't tell what's gonna happen, so let's just not be engaged. Which honestly, I respect that the most. I understand it.
Right. I mean, look, I suppose that's a lot of fun. We could sit here all day with that. I try not to go too deep into hypotheticals because it gets so far away from reality that it could just go anywhere.
Okay.
You know,
but we are talking
like
about the Poles' active statements about atomic weapons.
Well, okay, so yes, and I think if we were to return to that, I would say that they're happening in the context of where the current borders of the conflict stand. And so for your argument to kind of hold up, you would have to assume that the Ukrainians, with our support, even could take back all that territory, which is a huge maybe. But even if they're able to do that, like, let's say I grant you that, like, okay, yeah, we continue to support Ukraine for a year. They push the Russians all the way back to the 2022 borders. Russia has to sign some more favorable agreement to Ukraine to end the war. Does that necessarily mean that the Poles don't want a nuclear weapon? Well, I would say if I'm Poland, I'm still somewhat concerned about my security here because I see a nuclear power not far away from my borders, who's just engaged in what is now, would then be like a 4-year conflict that required hundreds of billions of dollars in aid from the Americans and Europeans, and destroyed tons of infrastructure, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And there's no certainty that the Russians won't do that again, regardless of what America does, regardless of what Europe does. So I don't know if that's a certainty that the Poles will just abandon their nuclear aspirations. I think that's sort of like a leap of faith.
I'm not saying that I'm certain. None of this is certain. What I am doing is I want to create the best conditions so that they feel like they can safely make the determination that they don't need it. That is because if you can create those conditions, I think that governments that are trying to figure out how to balance their budget and don't have a world reserve currency will probably take the pathway that will allow them to have more money for tax cuts, depending on who they are, or social spending. And you can see this dilemma with voters all across Europe right now as they're talking about the rearmament program and what would be necessary in order to spend the money to increase artillery production, to increase armored vehicle production, etc. And I do want to throw out just quickly, one moment, somebody, my chat's a little wild. They don't need to take it all back in order to get the land back physically. It could be done in the settlement where the Russians, after 4 years of fighting, know that there's not really an end for it in sight. It's getting too expensive. The economy's taking too much pressure, and they're willing to take a deal where they trade land for land. Okay, Ukraine, you can get back Mariupol, you can get back this, we'll pull back from this, but you cannot take back this, and that. We'll make this term because our economy is under too much pressure and we need to make a deal. You don't need to physically take something back in order to get it back in negotiations. So I understand that the idea of, for example, Ukraine taking back Mariupol right now doesn't seem particularly practical in the immediate, but you can still make demands in negotiation and get land in other ways than having to physically take it. And if Russia wants that access to American markets again, or wants to remove that economic pressure that is starting to feel painful, I think that's leverage. And if you can't get the land back, you can certainly get the kids that were kidnapped back. You can certainly get something that was kidnapped back, even though our current administration doesn't seem to be very willing to use that leverage. I also want to put forward that the Poles only really started discussing this after Trump pulled aid. At least when talking about the Polish government. Now, there's Polish citizens that have discussed this ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But when it comes to the government, it was only after America rug pulled Ukraine that we had their foreign minister coming out saying, like, well, an atomic Poland. So it seems like the pathway that we were taking where we were supporting Ukraine was the pathway where we were avoiding an atomic Poland. The pathway where we pulled the rug on Ukraine is a pathway where Poland's thinking, well, damn, Maybe we need the power of the sun in our weapons arsenal.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is also like a way of reading that where you could say, okay, so therefore the polls might not be serious, and they're just trying to bait us into continuing to support the war effort under the threat of them developing their own nuke. And
but they're also the heaviest military spenders in all of Europe.
Well, no, yeah, I'm not that. Okay, fair enough, but I don't know if that necessarily means that it's because that we're going to withdraw our support that the poll, like we're the only, okay, one serious flaw in this that I thought about since we're going back and forth, and you made a lot of points. We'll move on.
Yeah, we can hit on the
ones,
other points because I don't know. I can do like another hour, but I want to make sure that we address everything else. If you want to address anything else.
Yeah, well, just one final word on it. Like a country like Iran, which is striving to develop its own nuclear weapon, and we've had on and off again agreements with them trying to basically urge them to dismantle their nuclear program.
Support making these deals, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you can avoid a nuclear Iran, because that's a country that I could feasibly see be pushed into a situation where they feel like they have to use it. And so that was kind of my question was, okay, if Iran, do you think that we should do more to help Iran feel secure to prevent them from developing a nuclear weapon, i.e. like maybe broker some sort of non-aggression pact between the Iranians and Israel or the Iranian proxies in Israel?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, look,
I was a supporter of the Iran deal. I believe stopping. Everybody's terrified of India, Pakistan. If the world could snap its fingers and India and Pakistan would lose all of its atomic weapons, I think you would probably snap your fingers. I would probably snap my fingers. Because when you listen to atomic planners, the two countries that scare the world the most are those two countries facing each other down, right? Israel and Iran being added to the situation would probably make them feel more anxious. And so I would like to keep a non-nuclear Iran if we can. And if that means that we have to negotiate some non-aggression pact or even the loosening of sanctions, I'm willing to do that. I understand the American government's concerns about those funds being sent to the proxies, but I think that at the end of the day, an atomic Iran is more dangerous than some more assets going to the proxies. And you can still find other ways to put pressure on those assets going to the proxies. Not to mention, now that Assad's gone, the Iranian regime is going to have more difficulty, period, getting weapons to Hezbollah and into Gaza anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point is more that if your theory is we should try to shore up or help shore up the defenses of non-nuclear countries to deter them from developing nuclear weapons.
I agree about that for our enemies as well, yes.
Well, yeah, that's my only point is that it's not even so much that I'm trying to corner you into agreeing.
You're just trying to see if it's a consistent principle. I understand.
Well, I guess I'm even just saying for the benefit of, the audience, this would make you, obliged in a way to then provide similar security guarantees or assurances, if not guarantees, to other countries that wish to develop or could potentially want to develop nuclear weapons, be it Iran, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, et cetera. And, my criticism of that, my main one, and of course we'll move on from here, is just that potentially opens up America to engaging in lots and lots and lots of other conflicts, possibly endless conflicts.
Well, I don't think America needs to be the nation state taking the lead on all of this. That would be like one critique I could, but the difficulty is who else, right? Because I could say like, I don't think America has to be the one brokering the Iran deal, right? It could be Germany. It can be the Europeans who want to trade with the Iranians. It could be anyone. But if nobody else takes that international role or nobody else is willing to do that, then it's kind of difficult. But if somebody else can do it in any situation, it's easier for us. I prefer it. It makes us all safer.
Sure. Right, but I'm speaking as an American, right? Like I'm concerned mostly with what our government is doing, how they're engaging with the world. So, but okay, let's get to some of your other points, and I did do my best to keep track of them. The second one you made is America really should support and should hope to maintain a stable, you call it a stable, united Europe. And part of that is like our historical ties to Europe, going back to World War II. I would even give you like our historical ties to Europe, going back to the founding of our country,
Voltaire,
right? Like
the Western whatever. Yeah, I get the idea. Yeah.
we are inherent. I say this to my students: we're inherently linked to Europe, right? In many, many, many ways, right down to our language. So, okay, fair enough. And another point you made is that we should have some loyalty to Europe because of the men and women and Europeans who died helping defend America post 9/11 and the war on terror.
It's not specifically the war on terror, but it's the principle of, if a nation state, you make an agreement with the nation state that if you're attacked, they'll help you, and then they do, you should reciprocate that for your own credibility's sake, if nothing else.
Well, and so in that case of like a mutual defense assurance, are you referring specifically to NATO?
I mean, NATO, yeah, but also we didn't just give security assurances to NATO state. For example, Finland was not in NATO, but we made agreements with Finland, and they were kind of like making like partnerships with NATO. And so I would include them in this because I consider them still a partner and in a way an ally with the United States. Same with Ukraine, where while they weren't part of NATO, Article 5, we had other agreements with them. They went with us into Iraq. They had 18 of their guys die in Iraq with us. They supported us in other ways during the war on terror. And we told them that if they were ever attacked, that we would support them. So I would consider that also a plus. Ukraine, Europe, the kind of in their backyard, same continent.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So we're in some sense beholden to defending Europe, or we should strive to defend Europe and maintain its security and all of that stuff because of historical agreements, NATO being one of them, an actual alliance that we're, a large contributor to, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, let me give you that. Let me say, yeah, okay, we're inherently linked to Europe. A stable Europe is good for America. A stable Europe is good for the world, for lots and lots and lots of reasons. It even goes beyond all the ones that you listed. I would say that at this point, like, is Europe's security at risk? I would say for sure. So the question then would be, how do we best defend Europe from any potential outside threat? And this is where I know we're going to totally disagree. But I would say the best way of assuring that is first and foremost ending the conflict that already exists. We're several years into this war, and it doesn't appear to be going in Ukraine's favor. I would say continuing to fund the war effort with the hope that the Ukrainians can turn the tide is sort of a fool's errand, and that we might better be served to negotiate with the Russians in such a manner that we can come up with an agreement that ensures Europe's security. Now, the only way that I could see you disagree with that is if you say, well, you just can't trust Russia at all. I don't know if you have that view that we just can't trust the Russians whatsoever. What do you say?
Well, I mean, I don't trust the Russians whatsoever, but that doesn't mean you can't negotiate with them. Like, I don't necessarily trust the Iranians all that much, but that doesn't mean that we don't make a deal with them. It's a question of enforcement. It's a question of monitoring. It's a question of, not trust, but verification, right? Where you could make a deal with the Russians under the understanding that we have a big gun, they have a big gun, they don't want to be shot with a big gun, they'd probably attack if we didn't have a big gun, but we have a big gun. You get what I'm saying? It's not just a question about like, oh, are these the nice guys, right? We made agreements with Stalin. He wasn't a nice guy. We made agreements with all sorts of people that weren't nice guys because we felt there was a certain amount of strategic necessity or, just for, security and the preservation of life. I would say, though, while I'm not against the idea of talking to the Russians or making a deal with the Russians seem to be against that idea. Because Donald Trump, who I would say has probably given the Russians one of the best offers of any politician in American politics could give them, where he's said there's going to be no NATO membership for Ukraine. That was a demand since the very beginning that has been conceded to them. There would be no U.S. troops in Ukraine, no U.S. Marines, no nothing in Ukraine, no American bases, none of that. That's a big concession. That's something that could have been traded for the kidnapped Ukrainian children. That's something that could have been traded, I don't know, for Mariupol or land. Like, fine, you give them the land back. We promise no troops. That was traded before negotiations even started. 91% of Ukrainians want Ukraine to be at the negotiating table. They weren't there with the Russians. It was the United States talking to the Russians alone, which was, again, a big demand by the Biden administration that Trump gave up right off the bat, right? And so he's given up this, he's given up that, he's given up this, he's given up that. And that's on top of his normal NATO bashing and talking about, wait, Article 5 is a little shaky. And after all that, after these demands to the Ukrainians and the public humiliation of Zelensky, he eventually gets the Ukrainians to agree after cutting off support, doing basically anything you could imagine that could be done to assist the Russian war position right now when it comes to what we could cut off to help them, including things that are no cost to us. Then there's the 30-day ceasefire offer made yesterday. Or was it 2 days ago or was it yesterday? I honestly forget. Time flies by. But it was just made, and it was rejected. Putin said he accepted it, but then he said, we'll only accept it under these terms, and then issued all of the terms that he's been issuing since the very beginning, including the annexation of territory that he currently doesn't control, like Kherson, where I filmed it, and I know that the Russians are hunting civilians, whether it's for sport, whether it's for practice, whether it's for something. I don't know the exact reason, but there's tons of video evidence, there's tons of testimony, and the Ukrainians are not going to be willing to make those concessions. And so if they did, Zelensky would not stay in power. And it wouldn't be because he lost an election, it'd be because he'd be dragged out of office, because they would see them as conceding their communities to be hunted by those who are doing the human safari. And so I agree that out of necessity, even though I believe in principle the Ukrainians have a right to the nation state, in principle that the Ukrainians have a right to have a democracy and not be occupied, in principle that we should stand up for our credibility, we still might have to negotiate because it's the best thing we can get in a bad situation. But we don't just let the Russians apply their terms with no concessions, because if we apply those terms on the Ukrainians, they're not going to concede. I think the war will drag on without us, and then it'll just be more bloody because the Ukrainians will be in a worse position. I think the only way to practically end this war is to put the Russians in a position where it's beneficial for them to continue it, because if they, not continue the war, but to take the deal, because if they do, it's just going to be painful, and it's just going to put them in a worse position, which means strengthening the Ukrainians. I don't think by weakening the Ukrainians, cutting off aid or something like that, it's going to help, really. I think it's just going to make it worse.
I see. Okay, yeah, a few things in that. And I agree with, in general, with most of the facts there. I don't know so much detail about what you're saying about human safari, but look, I don't have.
It's okay. Look, we don't need to get into specifics. You can Google it afterwards. There's tons of footage. I'm releasing a documentary on it in the next 2 weeks. You can watch that when it comes out.
Okay, and anyone in the audience, Dylan Burns 1776 on Twitter or X, find him. You can watch his content. But okay, so given that, right? Like, let's just grant you all of that, right? I still say that Ukraine is in a position, whether it's continued to be, whether it's U.S. support is maintained for the time being with the understanding that we have to negotiate a peace settlement soon, or that we totally withdraw aid and that we have to negotiate peace right now. One way or another, it seems like Ukraine is going to have to settle on peace terms that are probably more favorable to Russia than Ukraine. Would you agree?
More favorable. I think giving up any of Ukraine's land, in my mind, is like something that's favorable to Russia, but it might not be favorable to the regime or favorable towards their war goals. Do you get what I'm saying? Because like the original war goals was taking over the whole country, and then they settle for you won't be in NATO, right? That's like a huge, like that's a war goal that has been achieved, but I don't know, like it's hard to say. I understand that right now the Russians are advancing, but there is some information that I think people don't emphasize when understanding the amount of leverage that Ukraine has. And I think this information should be taken into account, not to say that let's enter the Crimea land cult, or I'm not going to call it, I shouldn't call it a land cult, because people do want to go back to their homes, but I'm not going to lose all the lives in the world to take back Crimea. The first thing is the Ukrainians are massively increasing their long-range drone production. And you don't need to just ask me about this, ask the Russians about it. The numbers that they're reporting are going from 12 to 24 to triple-digit numbers, where these drones are doing attacks across the country, hitting oil refineries, which is the basis of the Russian economy. It's not the only basis of the Russian economy, but I think we both agree that without energy production, the Russian economy would cease to function. And so the Ukrainians have been targeting that relentlessly. And that means, right before the Jeddah talks, we saw drones smacking into Moscow like crazy, hitting oil refineries, some of the biggest ones that produce like 11 billion barrels of oil. Now, that isn't going to bring an immediate end to the war. This is a type of pressure that builds up over time, and you need time to build up that pressure. But that is leverage that Ukraine has that's only expanding. Now, these are Ukrainian numbers, and I'm telling you that in advance for, transparency's sake. The Ukrainians say that they're going to produce 30,000 long-range drones this year and 3,000 drone missile hybrids this year if numbers hold, and their, expansion capacity continues to go in the direction it is. If we get 80 to 70% of that, Not even like if we get anywhere close to that, that's going to be more drones fired at Russia than the entirety of this war up to this point combined for just this year. And so that, I think, is significant leverage that needs to be taken into consideration. There's also, of course, the sinking of the Black Sea Fleet. The Russian flagship is at the bottom of the ocean there. They've lost 50% of the Black Sea Fleet, and they cannot reinforce it because the Turks control the strait that is necessary to pass to reinforce it, and the Turks won't let them. The Russians also, and we talked about this last time, the soldiers that they're recruiting are getting older and older. At the start of 2024, the average age for a volunteer who was signing a military contract was 40. Mid 2024 was 45. End of 2024, it was 50. This is a rapid aging of the Russian volunteer population who's taking these $25,000 or $30,000 contracts. And for all the problems that the Ukrainians have with manpower, Russia has, 3 to 4 times the size of, the population that Ukraine has. They are not able to deploy conscripts in the war zone. They have to get people to agree to go to Ukraine, sign a contract for some amount of money. And that's becoming harder and harder and harder. And the one way to get around that would be mobilization. The one thing Putin has been afraid to do, because the one time he mobilized before is the only instance where even the Russian polling said that Putin's popularity took something like a 20 to 25 point dip to the point that it was aiming below 50%. And he's scared of that. And I think that that also gives Ukraine a significant amount of leverage. Now, they also have their own manpower problems. I would even say that those manpower problems are more immediately acute. But that doesn't mean the Russians don't have their own manpower problems. And it's a lot harder and takes a lot more men to take a trench than it is to defend a trench, at least in my experience. Not that I've defended a trench, but I've seen many men do it. Either way, my main point is when Ukraine has all these cards, and I do think the Ukrainians, due to just the basis of what this war is, have more of a willpower to fight. I think this leverage needs to be taken into account, and it's not being taken into account by administration. Trump saying that Ukraine has no cards. He says this over and over to Zelensky's face. You have no cards. Russia has the cards. We have the cards. Now, he's changed his rhetoric recently because I'm sure some diplomat tapped him on the shoulder and he said, it's probably not smart to say that your side has no leverage, sir. It's probably not very intelligent. Either way, even if he sees Ukraine at his side. But if they're not addressed as if they have cards and that leverage isn't brought to the negotiating table, then the Ukrainians are not going to take the negotiating table seriously and the war is going to drag on. So I agree that a settlement should be made if it can be made. I just hope it can be made with a decent accounting of Ukrainian leverage.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said a lot of things there. The big thing that jumps out to me right away is the whole question of like the will to fight and leverage here. And I think, okay, I really have two things to say there. One, it's kind of like impossible to quantify that, right? Like if you're trying to plan strategically and you're thinking like, okay, what's the realistic goal here? How long should we be? Like if you and I were sitting in the Defense Department and we're like, okay, how many years down the road are we looking at until like Ukraine is a favorable, advantage or more favorable advantage such that we can start negotiating seriously? How much money is that going to cost, et cetera? When we're trying to figure out that calculation, it's difficult to just say, well, the Ukrainian will is greater because of this, that, and the other reason. So therefore, we're certain that it'll take this long and not this long. It's not.
Well, I can't give you
really.
I can't give you a certain year that this is going to end. The same way that I'm sure any general that walked in front of any like commander in 1940, when is this going to end? This war's been going on. It's 1942. It's been 3 years now. If you don't know the conditions, then it's kind of hard to immediately know when it's going to end. There are some trends you can look at. And I know we had some discussion about this before, but Russian armored reserves are draining and they're draining fast. And it's not just a question of getting to zero. They need those armored reserves for other parts of the country. They have the largest country on the planet. That's a lot of land to cover. And if you have a rebellion in the middle of Tuva because you raised taxes a little bit too much after the war, you're going to need something to put that down. Or if one of your national allies like Belarus has another election that goes awry and the protests start, you need troops available to deploy. Or Kazakhstan, that happened a few years ago when the Russians put troops in Kazakhstan to put down protests that were against the government cutting fuel subsidies. Anyway, the point is that they need those troops at other locations as well. And so once you see these trends, it seems pretty clear to me that we're already seeing the Russians rely more and more on replacement for armored vehicles because they're getting too low. And by the end of 2025, they will be in an even worse position when it comes to armored vehicles. Now, can I tell you that once they get rid of all the armored vehicles, they're going to quit? No, because the Russians can also infiltrate the front line with just infantry. They can just put them on motorcycles and go-karts and say charge. It's going to mean a lot more casualties. It's going to be a lot more painful. It's going to mean more cost for the Russian war effort, which continues to build pressure upon them. But they can continue to say, you know what? We don't care. We're going to keep the war effort because I'm betting this all on my regime. This is, if we lose here, my regime goes under. And it's impossible to calculate for sure that they're going to make these decisions. But if you show pathways to the Russians where you go this way and you continue the war, it's going to end, just going to be in a worse position in a year. This way is going to be in a worse position in a year. This way it's going to be in a worse position in a year. When most of the pathways that they look down lead to them being in either worse position or gone, then I think that'll be when they come to the negotiating table seriously. And before that point, any negotiation will end with a pause in the war, not a stopping of the war. Because all the terms that they're putting forward now, I don't know, did you see the Russian demands today for their counterance to Trump's demand?
Yeah. I mean, and so from what I understand, it's annexation of all 4 provinces, no Ukraine, basically Ukraine is demilitarized. Well, yeah, I kind of give you Crimea as a given. Maybe that's not fair, but yeah, annexation of all those provinces, demilitarization of Ukraine. What am I missing here?
Demilitarization of Ukraine. Oh, and no peacekeepers. There can be no other army in Ukraine.
No international peacekeepers.
So no army to defend Ukraine. They have to lose all these, all this territory, and there could be nobody to stop them from invading again. It is all of Russia's terms that would make it very easy for them to invade again. If Ukraine doesn't have an army, and there's no army to defend themselves, and they've been invaded twice when the Russians said they were not going to invade them up until the last second, as a Ukrainian leader, how could you even accept those terms without just seeing it as national suicide?
Yeah. Okay. Look, I get that. And if I were the Ukrainians, I would definitely not agree to that. But okay. Again, the topic really is more so our support for the war effort. And I think when I talk about projections, no, you really can't quantify to be very specific, like, okay, it'll take us a year, blah, blah, blah. But I do think that when these decisions are made, they should factor in likely scenarios, unlikely scenarios. And I think that, our military intelligentsia is probably very informed and willing to make those decisions based on really good, really reliable data, or at least the best data that the world has to offer, right?
I also trust given the CIA, Mr. Communist.
Well, what I mean is they know better than you and I do how this would play out in another year. And I think what the calculations they're making are such that they feel like, hey, it's probably not going to be good for Ukraine a year from now, given the current rate of the conflict.
Yeah, let me be blunt with you. I don't trust the new top intelligence official in this country. I don't trust Tulsi Gabbard to analyze intelligence. She's never held an intelligence position in her life. At the start of the war, she was talking about Russian biolabs and how this is so threatening to the she is somebody who RT literally calls her their gal. I don't know if you saw how Russian state TV talked about Tulsi Gabbard, but they play her in a bikini with a machine gun, firing at target. They show her as fucking Wonder Woman, Tulsi Gabbard. And my problem isn't that I think Tulsi Gabbard's literally on the payroll of the Russians, even though she seems to be doing it at no cost, their work on occasion. I don't trust her analysis of the intelligence. And I especially don't trust Donald Trump's analysis of her analysis of the intelligence. Not to mention the other advisors in the room. The most senior, serious foreign policy voice that I don't even like. I don't like Marco Rubio. I never liked little Marco. I'm not a big fan of his foreign policy in Latin America. I'm not a big fan of his foreign policy in reference to the Iranians. But I mean, he's the person in there that's actually been on Senate Foreign Affairs committees. He's the person in there that actually has paid attention during these briefings where we listen to Donald Trump. And as the story goes, and from his former staffers, they tried to highlight the words in his intelligence briefings with bullet points and colorful words to try to get his attention. My point is, I don't really trust this administration to analyze exactly how the war is going. I maybe would have trusted, even though I'm not the biggest fan of Lloyd Austin, I maybe would have trusted someone like Lloyd Austin. I maybe would have trusted some other people with experience. But we've got a Fox News host Tulsi, the grifter Gabbard, and we have who else advising the president on this, who's already not that informed on the conflict. So my problem is, I understand that there are people who are experts, and I tend to, not just completely disrespect them, but I don't see these people as experts.
Well, okay, there's plenty of criticisms to go around for Tulsi Gabbard and all of these people, Marco Rubio, et cetera, et cetera.
And they're the ones that are saying that Ukraine has no cards. It's not the
right.
it's not the people on, in the think tanks or the experts. It's them.
All right. Let me try to get in and respond to some of this stuff, because I feel like you're saying a lot. And, look, so all the criticisms that you can make of Marco Rubio and Tulsi Gabbard, even if they're all totally valid, they're still working with more up-to-date, more accurate data than either of us have access to. There's still people who are surrounded by other experts, and again, I'm not suggesting that, the deep state isn't corrupt and fucked up, in the Trump administration or in the, whatever, like, as you say, Mr. Communist. Okay, I don't trust any of these people necessarily, but I do think they make long range determinations based on data. And in terms of like Lloyd Austin and the Biden administration, it surprises me to say that you would trust them more, given the fact that they probably did not project that the war would turn out the way it has. That's why they kept investing so much money into it. And, here we are 3 years in, and it looks like Ukraine is in a really difficult spot. So I'm kind of inclined not to trust any of those people, regardless of how much I like or dislike Tulsi or Marco or any of them. I do think that they're probably looking at data that tells them, hey, the war is going this way. Reasonably, we could expect it to turn out like this or this or this, depending on how much money we invest, et cetera. And I would say, dude, there has to be a limit in terms of the price tag, in terms of the time investment, in terms of the investment of human lives. At some point, you have to start talking about peace. And I think we're reaching that point now.
We are.
The Ukrainians are kind of in that position. And I know what you're saying about will to fight. I even sort of agree with you. The Ukrainians do have a greater will to fight. But a lot of their will to fight seems to really depend heavily on American support. And the American support has, even with the Ukrainian will to fight and American support, European support, we've still found ourselves in a positions where we've had basically this multi-year stalemate with hundreds of thousands of people dying at a minimum. And it doesn't seem like the Russians are anywhere close to being pushed out of the country. So how can we justify continuing this any longer?
See, you say that there has to be a limit, but that has to go both ways, right? It can't just be that there's a limit to how much we'll support Ukraine. There also has to be a limit to what we're willing to accept from the Russians. There has to be a limit to, like, fine,
I do agree with that.
And right now, when we see like them making demands for Kherson and Zaporizhia, I mean, we're talking about the displacement of hundreds of thousands to millions more people, when we already have Ukraine now being one of the biggest diasporas in the world now because of how many people that Russia has displaced. These are terms that, in my opinion, are non-starters. These are terms that are either meant to fail so they can continue the operations, or they legitimately think Trump will just completely sell them down the river, because the Ukrainians will not accept these terms. And so what I'm saying isn't that we need to fight until Moscow is liberated and we do like some voodoo spell to bring Alexei Navalny back from the grave so he can be the new lead. Like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we cannot make this war end with the conclusion from the Russians that this was the right thing to do. We should do it again. We have the opportunity to do it again because there's nothing for Ukraine to defend itself. And we're getting all of the land, including the land where we're abusing people, where we should try to limit as much land and as many people being abused by the Russian army as physically possible, as practical. And so right now, until the Russians give us a realistic response, to me, it's a non-starter. It's an indication that they right now, let's say your analysis is right, and the Russians, even though they're slowing down in the pace of their advance, and it's continued to have, and I think their advance right now is the slowest it's been in like 6 or 7 months or something. Let's say that they re-pick up with the spring offensive. They're preparing for the spring offensive that I'm hearing a lot of rumors about. Why would they accept terms? If America's breaking off right now, if America's pulling the rug and they see like Trump as somebody who's not that dedicated, as somebody who's going to leave anyway eventually, why would they pull out now and just not continue to push the war effort, continue to push, since they're seemingly putting out non-starter terms?
The Russians, you mean? Why would they not continue the war effort?
Yes.
I honestly believe, and this is where my chat's going to turn on me, but they're already sort of have, but whatever. There's not that many of them anyway. And frankly, they don't give me any money, so fuck them. But look, I think that the main reason the Russians are not emboldened to continue is because, quite honestly, the Russian military has underperformed here relative to expectations within Russia and internationally. I think that a lot of that is owed to Ukrainian resolve. I think the Ukrainians have fought bravely. I think they've fought effectively. I think some of that is partially due to our aid, right? But I happen to think that the Russians would be stupid to attempt to take the rest of this country, which is mostly inhabited by a hostile population who would actively resist that occupation 24/7, regardless of U.S. support. I think Putin is a lot of things. I don't think he's an idiot. I don't think that he would be emboldened to then take this whole country and attempt to lock it down and turn it into some sort of neo-Soviet republic or something like that, as much as that might sound cool in my head. I don't think the Ukrainian people want any fucking part of that. I think they would fight the Russians tooth and nail. And, I actually do somewhat disagree with you, and we're going to get into a whole tangent here, but fuck it, about the Russians' initial war aims here, about taking the whole country. I don't think that was ever the initial war aim. I think the initial war aim was cripple Kyiv as quickly as possible and get them to hastily sign some sort of peace agreement where they're going to agree, to basically neuter themselves militarily, not have any realistic defense, never join NATO. Possibly Zelensky or the Ukrainian government would, be dissolved and replaced with a more Russian-friendly one. But I don't think they wanted to physically, annex Ukraine and take the territory. And I know you might criticize that and say, well, what's the difference? I do think there is a difference. Maybe you disagree, but I don't see the Russians having any urgency to try to conquer the rest of Ukraine here. I think that they're hurting as well, and I think that maybe the language about this ceasefire has made it seem like the Russians are just dying to keep fighting here. I don't think that that's true. I think that the war has come with a significant cost, especially in terms of human life, and as you mentioned, military equipment.
So I agree that the Russians have done this at the cost and they've underperformed their expectations, but I don't think that has eliminated the hubris in their head. I really don't. They've underperformed, but they underperformed in their minds while fighting the entirety of the West. 1 billion strong alliance. And that's how they talk about it. That's how they talk about it domestically. That's how they talk about it on the world stage. That they're not fighting Ukraine, really. They're not even really fighting all of Europe. They're fighting the collective, degenerate, gay, homosexual, Satanist West, right? Whatever.
But do you think they really believe that?
Well, let me finish quick. I don't know if they believe the gay, Satanist, all that stuff. I do believe that they think that they're fighting the West. And I do think that Putin probably thinks that the West is degenerate, but I don't know if he believes the Satanist probably knows nonsense. But I do think he thinks he's fighting the West. And he thinks he's fighting the West because he's not only fighting Ukrainian developed weapons, he's fighting weapons from Germany, he's fighting weapons from France, he's fighting weapons from Spain, he's fighting weapons from Sweden, he's fighting weapons from the United Kingdom, and he's fighting weapons from the United States, as well as volunteers who, have come across Europe and the United States to go continue to join. Now, it's just a few thousand people, but still, in their mind, with all the financial aid, with all the military aid, and with all the support, and ideologically, the Ukrainians are representing the West. What they're fighting right now is the entirety of the West. Now, if one of the big blocks of the West, the United States, which provides, say, 40%, I think was the last number I saw, 40% of Ukraine's military aid was to drop out and say, we're done here, we're stepping away. From the Russian perspective, 40% of the West just backed off, surrendered, took a bow and said, we're not about this. Now imagine, and now we're going into hypotheticals here, but that's how the Russians think of the future. They think, is this going to happen? Is that going to, you have to work with some sort of plan of what's going to happen. If the normalization talks that we know that the United States government and the Russians are engaged in Saudi Arabia to try to normalize, maybe reopen trade and stuff like that, if that goes through and the Russians not only stopped 40% of Ukraine's support, but has also reopened itself economically to the international community, under that pathway, I don't see why they think they wouldn't be able to conquer as much as they wanted. Because then that would reinvigorate the war machine. That would mean CNC machines from the United States could come into Russia. That would mean increased artillery production. That would mean increased drone production. That would mean increased air defense production. And it would also mean that they not only could refurbish their old Soviet armored vehicles faster, they could probably produce new ones that are actually, of a higher quality much faster. And maybe they could even make up the difference from those old Soviet tanks that they're using more and more of. My point is that if the Russians see a pathway to go towards victory after thinking half the West just surrendered, I don't think it's such a crazy possibility that they wouldn't at least press on, or at least think that that's a possibility. So express that in negotiations, i.e. making crazy non-starter demands like give us Kherson. And so while on one hand, I don't know how bad the Russian army really is right now in a state where they might actually be like, let's get the best deal possible and cut before everything collapses. Most economists don't think there's immediate collapse, but that might be happening because they have commercialized the commercial banking sector, cannibalized the commercial banking sector. I think that it's enough of a risk that we need to be vigilant about it. Is there anything else I wanted to? I don't want to talk too much, so I'll just stop myself there.
No. I mean, because it's hard because we could go back and forth on each point. You made 4 points, so I do want to hit all of
Russia
them.
Wanted. One last thing, because you did say, I think that they were going to get what they could get. I don't think it was as solid as Ukraine no longer exists in a week. I think it was either Ukraine, and this is how Putin talked about it in his speech, which I tortured myself. I listened to it like 2 or 3 times. He was saying that Ukraine could either exist as an extension of Russia, therefore it's a Russian allied power where we annex probably Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, but then Ukraine exists as basically a Russian proxy state where they would, maybe they would lose their civil liberties, they probably lose their democracy, lose these things, but they would still exist as a thing called the Ukraine, and it would be an extension of Russia, or not at all. It cannot exist. Therefore, it would be annexed by Russia. And that's how Putin describes it in his essays, how Putin talks about it in his speeches. Now, annexing the entire country would probably be a harder pill to swallow than even the destruction of an occupation of their democracy and the trampling of their sovereignty. But I still think that if they could have achieved it, they would have. And I think that they had enough hubris to think that they could, or they wouldn't have invaded with the small army that they did. I mean, the march on Kiev was filled with so much hubris that you can only think that they genuinely thought that the Ukrainians would just buckle under the first pressure.
I mean, that's one way to read it. Another way to read it could be that they didn't want, a long drawn out war such that they would have, that would be required to capture the entire country, which is sort of the way I see it. I mean, if Russia really wanted to annex the entire thing,
it
require
all overnight. Yeah.
I happen to think that, we just probably disagree on Russia's real war aims there. And we should just leave that to the side because we could get bogged down to a whole thing. And honestly, we're 3 years in at this point. I'm really more focused on, do we continue supporting or not? Another thing you mentioned in your 4 points, your third one was, if we break Russia and Ukraine, then they're not going to be able to take Moldova, Georgia, etc. Right? All these other post-Soviet states where there's, this similar kind of, I would call it, especially in Georgia right now, like fragile kind of political situation where the Russians could conceivably interfere and whatever. I would say that at least, and I would hope you to acknowledge that at least part of the Russian incursion into Ukraine was this concern about their own security. And I would say that, whether or not that's legitimate or the only reason or whatever, it's at least part of it. And I would say that the Russians don't have those same concerns with Moldova or Georgia. Would you disagree?
No, they have the same concerns about Moldova and Georgia that they had about Ukraine.
Okay, could you maybe clarify some of that for me then? Because
it's not the exact same concern, but it's an extension of the same concern. I mean, NATO involvement in Georgia becoming part of NATO is definitely something that the Russians are scared of. And it's something that they talk about openly. And it's part of the reason why they support the current ruling party is because while they talk about joining the European Union and they've clearly kicking it down the road, which is causing protests in Georgia, either due to fear of being invaded again or otherwise, the ruling Georgian Dream Party is not pursuing NATO membership or really even pursuing EU membership despite its public statements, due to the fear of a Russian invasion in the same way that Ukraine was invaded, to be blunt. Moldova, I mean, it's not the same immediate threat because it's kind of hard because Ukraine's in front of them, so you can't really move troops in them unless you fly them to Transnistria. And if you're going to be invading Moldova when you have an enemy right behind, it's just not smart. It's a way to get all your troops killed if you were to try that out right now. But I mean, the Russians have invaded Moldova before in the last 25 years. That's how Transnistria was created. And they have been trying to interfere in Moldovan politics by paying off politicians and trying to influence their election results very openly. And I think that Moldova, if anything, these are the countries that I'm almost like most positive of them at least trying something if it goes well in Ukraine, because these are the non-NATO states where it has the least amount of risk for them trying stuff. And they're all former Soviet and Russian Empire areas as well that used to be controlled, that he would believe, for the same justification he believed in Ukraine, the Russian speakers, etc., that is part of Russia, because those Russian speakers exist in Moldova. And there are Russians in Georgia. It's a little bit more complicated there, though. It's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my point is, each of these scenarios is unique, or each of these countries is unique with their own unique circumstances. And I think it's somewhat of an assumption to say, okay, well, we know that Russia got interfered in Ukraine, they invaded. So therefore, it stands to reason that they're definitely going to invade Moldova, definitely going to invade Georgia if we don't do everything we can to, as you say, kind of break their will or their desire to do that. And okay, so if I'm going to grant you that, I say, all right, yeah, they could invade Moldova, they could invade Georgia.
Do you agree that these are the wars that empires need to lose?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Let's say that after the Iraq War, the general American consensus was that was a fantastic idea, that was good, that was a good idea. We invaded, it was fantastic. We should have overthrown Saddam. The real problem is that we didn't go into Iran too. Right? And let's say that was the popular American consensus, either because the government can control what consensus is delivered to the people through the media or otherwise. But that is either government inspired or otherwise was the popular consensus in the United States. What do you think the effects of that would be if most Americans supported Iraq after the fact, thought it was a good idea, and it was great?
Yeah, I see your point. Like, okay, so we would be emboldened, of course, to then go into Iran. Yeah, I think where you're going with this.
My point is that it doesn't only just become a calculus of like, hey, is this an intelligent military idea to invade this nation state? Which is the public statements of the government can still become the internal logic of the state. If you keep saying that this was a good idea, eventually that still can become the internal logic. But then it will also push the government in a position where they're rewarded for the more chauvinistic they become, more bombastic they become, the more aggressive they become. And nation states invading other countries to distract from domestic issues, say an economy hollowed out by a destructive war and economic issues that are slumbering and not going to go away anytime soon, could lead to, I think, more aggression, especially if people can sell to the political leaders that, well, if we invade Ukraine, then we have more people, demographic issue fixed, et cetera, et cetera. My point is that if these are the types of wars you need to get a negative response into your calculus from, so you know that there was a mistake there, so it will at least be hesitant when engaging in it in the future.
Yeah, look, to some extent, you acknowledge that this is apples to oranges. I see your point, but look, in the case of the Iraq War, the reason I think most Americans feel that was a tremendous mistake and it left a bad taste in everyone's mouths is not that we had a spectacular military failure. I mean, we were there for many years, right? Which was, I guess you could argue, is to some degree a failure, but we wiped out Saddam Hussein relatively quickly. We achieved at least some of our war aims in a pretty short amount of time. It's just that the justification for war proved to be false. And it ended up creating all these other exogenous problems, ISIS, et cetera, and that became, this sort of terrible thing that most of us had to reconcile ourselves with.
It's not about Iraq. It's more about, you agree that Iraq was a bad idea, yes?
Obviously, yeah.
Okay. And you don't support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, despite what people might say in chat, right?
No, I don't. I don't.
So we agree that these were both bad ideas, and neither of their governments should have made these decisions. Yeah.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
if we want these governments, these regimes to not make these decisions again, the best way to do that is that when they put an input, that output is a bloody nose, right? I mean,
But
it's a
okay,
simple way
but
to put it.
no,
But
I get your argument. I just my point in pointing out in mentioning all the particulars here is to really say it's not that simple. Like, okay, look at what happened to the Russians with the Chechen wars, which the second Chechen war went better for the Russians than the first, right? But in both cases, it was this long, especially the first, this long drawn out thing, which did not go as planned, you could argue, in many ways. And I think the point being, like America and Vietnam is another example. Yes, okay, there's something to the idea that there's hesitation to engage in another war because of the risk of losing or the risk of being embarrassed or, experiencing some sort of civil unrest as a result of war fatigue or frustration or whatever. I do think that goes into the calculus when a country is trying to decide, should we invade, should we interfere, et cetera. But it's certainly not the only factor here. Like, I think Russia will, if it decides to invade Georgia, it's going to be, a multi-dimensional analysis as to whether or not they should do that. And yes, their performance in Ukraine has something to do with that. I just don't know if additional funding of the war effort at this point will sway the Russians one way or another, unless they experience some sort of
let me ask you a
catastrophic
question.
collapse.
Here's a question. Do you think if the Vietnam, because we lost, I grew up, I was raised by a Vietnam vet, right? So Vietnam was, we didn't talk about it, right? But, it was something that I did a decent amount of research into and studying, and like the effects of, Walter Cronkite's reports, why we eventually pulled out. If that death toll doubled, our Vietnam death toll, do you think the effects psychologically on the American public would have been different? Or do you think that depending on, like, if let's say the cost for the war financially, in lives, and in reputation, we amplified that by a significant amount, how do you think that would have changed the American psyche or changed American behavior?
I mean, of course, it would make the Americans less willing to engage in a war or more afraid of entering into another foreign war if the death toll doubled. I agree.
So my point is just generally that the cost cannot be a calculation in the Kremlin where the amount they put down in their investment was less than what they got out. Basically, you go to a casino, you put in $20, you leave with 10. That's what I think needs to come out. They might be like, look, we got Crimea, we got parts of Donetsk, we got parts of Luhansk, but man, at the end of the day, that was too much. That war there was too much in lives, too much material, too much in et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need to not do that again, right? Maybe it's going to be impossible for them to get them to leave with $0, but if you make them leave with 25, they're going to come back to 30.
Yeah. So look, just using the same logic here, you would have to, well, I would wonder, what would the cost be in Ukrainian lives and US and European dollars to double the Russian death toll?
To double the Russian, I would double the Russian death toll. I don't know. It depends on strategy, because honestly, early on in the war, dude, it was a mess. It was all chaos. It was people like, honestly, like, I hear the Russians are here. Let's get some guns. Let's go to, and that type of fighting comes with extremely high casualties. And then we also saw the most artillery bombardments at the start of the war, where since then it's gone down because everyone's engaged in rationing. And so it's not as simple as like just taking the current death toll and doubling it on both sides, because the type of battles have changed, but it would take a significant investment of lives, material, and personnel, which is also why I'm okay with negotiations. I'm fine with avoiding this scenario, but it has to be through, hey, there's the road that you can walk down. Let's not walk down it. Take a reasonable deal. Because there has to be, like we agreed earlier, there has to be a limit. Do you think the Ukrainians should give up Kherson?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not Ukrainian, and so if I was, I would say we should give up no territory.
But
and
putting
Kherson is
aside personal. Let's talk about strategic. What effect do you think that would have? If not even like putting aside the hunting and all that, what effect do you think it would have if we made Ukraine concede to all of Russia's demands that they're currently making?
Well, I mean, the effect it would have on Ukraine in terms of what, like
Effects on Ukraine and effects on like the future of European security. Let's just say that, like the few prospects of a future war.
I mean, if Ukraine caves to every single Russian demand, I don't know if that makes necessarily Europe any more or less safe. You know, I think that it's horrible for Ukrainians to have to give up territory, especially territory that hasn't been entirely lost in a war that hasn't been willfully surrendered. I think it's, you know, humiliating in many ways for the Ukrainians to have to negotiate from a losing position such that they concede everything. You know, I feel bad and all of that stuff. I just don't know if that makes Europe any more or less like my point is like Europe's safety or the perception of safety hinges upon really what's already happened here. And what's already happened here is we've seen, you know, this long, protracted, drawn out conflict where it appears that both sides are to some extent trying to drain the other's military capacity. It's killed hundreds of thousands of people. And, you know, we feel like less safe than ever before because Russia is now a hostile nuclear armed power right on the border of Europe, which has the option to intervene militarily. It's shown a willingness to do that. And so the question then becomes, how do we prevent Russia from, what is the best means of stopping Russia from doing that again? Because we've tried fighting them in Ukraine and, you know, we've basically hit a deadlock here. We're not going really past the current battlefield lines.
Well, I feel like, honestly, and I'm sorry if I'm interrupting, but it is true that we have sent aid to Ukraine, we have sent military aid to Ukraine, but this is a dedication of like 3 years of strategy, followed by 10 years of failed Obama, Biden, and Trump policy on Ukraine. None of them being able to negotiate anything, none of them being able to find a solution, and with most of the negotiation and deal making, basically just allowing the Russians to continue to push it forward, whether it be in Crimea, whether it be in Donetsk, whether it be in Luhansk, whether it be their direct invasions of the country, which they were denying the whole time. And so I feel like in 2022, there was a change in gears, which didn't change completely. But there was, of course, very public disputes between the White House and the Ukrainians, exactly what permissions they could have for long range strikes and, you know, exactly how much weapons they should get. But I don't see this war going on for another 3, 4, 5 years for the same reason that, like, I just don't think it's possible. I'm sorry, same reason. I'm getting distracted by chat right now. They're a little rowdy. It's not possible to continue it for another 5, 4, 3 years because neither side has the material. They don't have the manpower. It's not possible to drag it that long. And so really right now, it seems to me the war is two powers tired, restricted on certain things where Ukraine doesn't want to mobilize 18-year-olds. Russia doesn't want to mobilize the general population due to political backlash. And they're swinging, trying to see by the last swing, whenever the deal is signed or the deal is made, who can get like the last swing in, the last pressure to be able to be the one with the more leverage in negotiations. If you're going to aim for that goal, I think that's a much aiming for that better last swing is more likely to bring about peace than just conceding to the majority of Russian terms at this point. Because if you look at Russian terms, they're terms for another war. They're terms where Ukraine cannot defend itself. It's terms where Europe cannot come to Ukraine's defense. It's terms where there's no troops in Ukraine to be peacekeepers to stop the Russians from violating agreements. Meaning they wouldn't even need to technically stop. They could just keep firing just intermittently. And who would be there to stop them? Would it be the Ukrainians who would fire back and then provoke another invasion? And so while I agree that the war has been bloody, it's been destructive, and that further investment will cost lives, but if we just pause the war and put Ukraine in a worse position 3 years down the line, I think that not only costs more lives anyway, it'll probably be bloodier, and then it means you're making the war a hereditary trait that's passed down to the children.
Well, okay. I mean, so I don't know, and neither do you. None of us do, like with any certainty, what could happen years down the line. But we disagree, I think, on to what extent Ukrainian territorial concessions are like a precondition for sustained peace in Europe. Let's just leave that there. You know, I think that there is such a thing as like an unfair deal for Ukraine, but I also think to what extent would we have to factor in like, okay, how many lives would have to be lost? How many dollars would have to be spent for Ukraine to get a more favorable deal? And to what extent would that more favorable deal secure peace any more than a deal would right now? And, to me, it's like, okay, if you want a much, much more favorable deal for Ukraine where they don't have to concede any of the stuff the Russians are asking for or most of it, you'd have to tell
Well, I
me
mean, like even
how
half
much
of
money.
Because let's be frank though. Like who's in charge right now? It's Trump. He's giving up everything. He's giving up everything before the negotiations started. I agree that if there was if I don't know if we had President Zelensky in a mustache as president of the United States and he was dictating United States policy, then I understand like the basis of where this critique's coming from. But we currently have an administration who seems to have prioritized Ukraine as a problem instead of the Russians, and so it's not a problem of like, oh, they're not willing to make any concessions. It's a problem of what concessions have the Russians been willing to make at all? Like the kidnapped children. There's about 19,000 Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped, some of which have been adopted out to Russian families. We've heard nothing about concessions made on that front. And so I don't see any movement towards asking for anything back from the Russians. And if you concede everything, I just don't see how you avoid another war, period.
I mean, look, just for the record, I don't know if there's no middle of the road between conceding everything to the Russians and continuing to fund the war effort. I think that there is a middle of the road solution, and I think that that can probably be negotiated out. I know that Trump is not, despite what he says, is not exactly the best deal maker when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And I mentioned this in our last debate, and I don't want to get on too much of a tangent here, but look, the Trump administration, if you look at some of these people, I mean, Keith Kellogg is one. I saw you, I think, tweeting about him, and, you mentioned him in a stream at one point. Keith Kellogg is a guy who's like a total Iran hawk. Trump is a total Iran hawk. I think these people want to pivot to the Middle East. And I think that they want Russia on favorable terms with the United States so they can try to sever Russia's ties with China, North Korea, and Iran. That's what Keith Kellogg has been quoted as saying. And I think the Trump administration wants to pivot to the Middle East, wants to focus on that conflict. They want to neuter and disable Iran and neutralize it as a threat to Israel. And I think that they also want to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And they're content abandoning Europe. And, look, to some extent, I understand the tendency to want to do that. But I think defending our own borders really does start in our hemisphere. And defending our own country starts in our hemisphere. But, I don't know. Like, I feel like they're just shifting the focus of imperialism. Regardless, I think that there definitely can be a solution here, which isn't just agreeing to every single Russian demand, but it also doesn't mean that we continue our full commitment to the Ukrainian war effort. I think we have to slow down. We have to stop funding. We have to pull back to some extent.
Yeah, I disagree. I think this is the worst position, actually. I'm sorry. I think this is the worst position.
Yeah, tell me why.
Because this is like you can't like have your cake and eat it too. I feel like there's a road to the left and there's a road to the right? There's two roads and we want to have both, so we're deciding to drive forward and we're going to crash into a tree. Because if we decide like, okay, we want this war to be over and we don't really want to continue, so we're going to cut aid to Ukraine. We're not going to stop aid to Ukraine, hoping that they'll come to the table. I fear that what this will end up doing is dragging out the war, because what we're going to do is we're going to lessen Ukrainian leverage. The Russians will continue to push forward, and it'll just drag the war out longer when the intention was to end the war. Where if you wanted to bring about the war on stronger terms, you would try to give the Ukrainians as much leverage as possible in advance of negotiations, have those negotiations under the idea that, like, look, we can continue this. It'll be horrible. It'll be painful. They have a decent amount of power. We've enabled that. How about we find this reasonable deal where you pull out of Kherson and Zaporizhia? Maybe you get to keep Crimea for now. Ukrainians don't have to recognize anything. We'll have some peacekeepers here, and that'll be the end of it for now. Everybody can fix their economies and deal with their own business. Something like that, that'd be more at least physically palatable for the Ukrainian nation state. But that's not being offered. I've yet to see anything like that.
Yeah. I think cutting aid to Ukraine was the Trump administration's attempt to force the Ukrainians to the table, and it kind of worked. they got the Ukrainians to agree to, at least in principle, a ceasefire deal that the Russians didn't agree to, of course. But I think that that actually did push things further along towards the direction of peace. Now it depends on the Russians, and the leverage we have on the Russians, of course, is our continued support of Ukraine. But I think if we show ourselves to be a good faith negotiator with the Russians and that we're willing to pull our aid from Ukraine if they don't come to the negotiating table, I think that that's the maximum leverage we really have in the situation. You know, continuing to just pour money into the conflict and expecting a good outcome or a better outcome because the Ukrainians will eventually push the Russians back. Trust us, it'll happen. You know, I don't feel good about that at all. I don't think that that's a likely thing whatsoever.
I'm not proposing that they're going to push them out of the country. My proposal is that we put them in a position where the Russians cannot continue to carry out the war, right? It's not expel them from Crimea. If you could do that, okay, put the Russians in a position where they cannot continue to carry out the war, so they have to come to the negotiating table. Because right now, the strategy you're talking about is putting pressure on the Ukrainians, not the Russians. We wouldn't be putting any pressure on the Russians. I mean, we wouldn't be adding pressure to the Russians. We wouldn't be giving the Ukrainians more leverage to get the better deal. We'd be putting the Ukrainians in the worst position possibly to get a worse deal. And I understand, like, we did get them to say, okay, we'll agree to a 30-day ceasefire. So they didn't advance peace talks. They didn't advance a ceasefire. The Russians responded immediately within 24 hours saying, no, give us Kherson. Give us this. It didn't advance it in any tangible way. It might, you know, if 10 miles from the gas station and you just kick the car and it goes forward a few inches, yeah, you've gone forward a few inches, but what have you achieved practically to get us closer to that peace deal, other than, you know, hurting the Ukrainian defense temporarily and making the Russians think you don't really care all that much?
Yeah, well, I mean, the analogies, Dylan, are classic, but I would say if you kick the car forward a few inches, it's still a few inches. It's better than nothing. But okay, look, let's say that, you know, my argument is really that we've put the Ukrainians in a position where they feel like a greater urgency to negotiate peace. Now it's on the Russians, and the Russians are not willing to go along with the ceasefire. So, okay, we continue, you know, aid to Ukraine with the understanding with the Russians that we'll continue discussions and negotiate terms for peace. You know, I do think that this is the route to ending the conflict. You know, whether or not progress is happening the way we want, whatever, I do think that this is the best means of achieving peace, because the other option, just continuing to fund Ukraine and having them continue to fight until Russia is essentially out of gas, right, to use your analogy, I don't know how long that will take, and I don't know the amount of carnage that will have to be incurred on the Ukrainian people, you know. And one thing that we haven't discussed at all, and this has been a key argument of mine from the beginning, is the cost this has on the global economy. You know, you do acknowledge, I'm sure, that the war is a contributing factor to inflation, right? It's not the only one, but it's a significant contributing factor to inflation.
I don't know if
that
I would say it's
inflation
significant in the United States, but I mean, in other countries, it's more, it depends on the country.
Well, I would say in the United States, it factors into, or at least it factored into, the price of oil. And the price of oil factored into the production of all goods in the world. So even though gas prices did come down in the United States domestically, you know, from the initial start of the conflict, what you saw is the contribution to inflation being the overall cost in oil rising. And I think the inflationary impact of that, along with various other factors, it definitely played a part in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and, you know, losing the election. A big basis of Trump support came from just, you know, really the price of groceries. So I do think that continuing to fund this war, the negative impact it could have on the lives of the average American, you know, is something that we have to factor in here. And so then it becomes a question of how much longer will this take? How much longer will it cost? And can we really justify that? Because is it going to achieve any more than it already has?
So I would also sorry, I forgot, you said something earlier in response and I forgot it on the second half. I'll just leave it alone. I'll just touch this. Sorry, my chat's been rowdy today. I agree that at a certain point, you know, cost builds up and you have to ask these questions, and these are questions we can ask ourselves. But I don't think we really answer the question or are cost effective by pretending there isn't a problem. And I feel that if what you said is true, that we're just pivoting out of Europe, that makes it feel to me that Trump would probably be willing to accept a pretty shitty deal for Ukraine, right? And let's say that he accepted one of the worst deals for Ukraine, which, maybe no peacekeepers, maybe no this, maybe no that. I don't see that as something that has necessarily brought peace, more that it's paused the war, and we've then sent that war to another generation. 3, 4, 5 years down the line, once the Russians are rebuilt up, they could go in straight again. And we can say, oh, it's a hypothetical. But at a certain point, we're acting with a little bit of naivete, right? They invade in 2014, saying they're not going to invade. Then they invade about, 8 years later, saying the same thing, they're not going to invade again. And so we can't be repeating this behavior and then acting surprised when another invasion happens, when we didn't create the conditions for peace. And so I agree that, immediately stopping the guns would immediately stop the bloodshed, and these would be good things that could also possibly help the world economy. I disagree with you with how much it would help the American economy. I honestly don't think the American consumer will see much, if any, difference once the war is ended when it comes to grocery prices. I also think that in some ways, the United States actually benefited from the war economically. Now, this is cynical, but we dominate European energy consumption now. We've replaced the Russians with LNG export, and we're exporting more LNG than we ever have in our life, and we're increasing our export capacity massively to make up that difference. And so in some ways, the wars have been somewhat economically damaging to the whole world, but they've also been economically beneficial to the United States in some ways. So I think that should also be taken into account. But again, it's not just a question of, the bloodshed is terrible, and the bloodshed right now. If we just pass the bloodshed 3 or 4 years down the road, we could make the situation worse, especially if we ask the Ukrainians to give up cities like Kherson. Now, most people might not, spend a lot of time, studying the Ukrainian map, but it won't take a lot of time to see that Kherson is across the river. And if the Russians are able to get cities and military positions across the main natural fortification that the Ukrainians have, that's a massive security issue. And that's one of their demands right up front.
Yeah, I mean, I've always sort of maintained as well that the notion that the Russians would invade Europe is, I mean, I think it's an exaggeration. The level of risk is greatly exaggerated. I don't think the Russians have any aspirations of creating a new Russian Empire, Soviet Union, any of that.
You think they're lying?
Well, in what do you mean when Putin said the collapse of the Soviet Union is some great tragedy? I don't think.
Well, no, when they say things like Russia can only exist as an empire.
I think that things like that can be misinterpreted or taken to mean that, okay, therefore Russia wants to conquer Europe.
Well, what's the interpretation of that, of your country can only exist as an empire? And you're a nationalist, meaning that you're proud of the empire.
I mean, one way to interpret that might mean Russia is composed of lots and lots and lots of like different ethnic groups. In effect, you could argue in some ways it is an empire, right? It could also mean the argument of like this new definition of empires.
Only exist as an empire, though.
Right, but this new definition of empires that we have in the 21st century, which is really the ability to project power beyond your borders, which is exactly what Russia's doing in West Africa, the Middle East, et cetera. It's something the United States does everywhere, right? China does primarily in Africa and somewhat in Latin America as well. I think that to say that you're an empire in the 21st century is very different than what it meant in even the early 20th century. It doesn't mean that Russia needs to then absorb as much territory as possible. But what it means is that, for it to be something approximating like a world power that can control its own destiny and not be at the behest of other world powers or under the yoke of other world powers, Russia has to be this big, strong, powerful country that can project power beyond its borders.
I think that, the threat of an invasion in Europe, it all depends on what Europe does, right? I don't think that, for example, I don't know if you know Atomwaffen, right? But it doesn't matter, Atomwaffen. But let's say these tiny terror groups that are not, we're not saying Atomwaffen's about to take over America. But if we stop looking into them and we stop looking into these terror groups, We don't do any effort to stop recruitment. And if you leave a problem unattended and you just appreciate it as a given that these things are not really a threat because we're just so powerful, you allow a problem to fester. And before you know it, Adam often isn't just like 12 incels. It's like hundreds of guys across the country with sleeper cells because you haven't spent the time and effort to deal with the problem. And since the Europeans have not spent and dealt with the time to deal with the problem of, Russia's incursions into Ukraine and its imperial aspirations, the problem has gotten worse and worse and worse until we have the largest scale, the largest war in Europe since World War II. And so I think that while it is true that the risk of Europe itself, like the EU states or NATO being invaded by the Russians is low, the possibility of these things happening increase the more we just take it for granted. If we take these security arrangements for granted, if we take Russia as not invading them for granted, and I think that is what Bush and Obama and maybe to an extent Trump and a lot of American politicians did when it came to making a relationship with the Russians. We kind of took the idea that they wouldn't really do this in Ukraine for granted. And that's why all the experts said that invasion wasn't happening. And then when it did happen, it'd be over in like 3 or 4 weeks. And so I don't want to take these things for granted anymore because I don't want to take that risk. Because you're right, there probably will never be Russian soldiers marching into Warsaw, at least in our lifetime. Like if I was to put a gun to my head and ask me what was the outcome. But I don't want to make it more likely. And I don't want to take any chances because we're dealing with lives and atomic weapons and intercontinental war. So for me, it's deal with the problem at the base, and we need to more appreciate these institutions and strengthen them because we're currently degrading them. It is true that, if everybody was super strong about Article 5 in NATO, I think the Russians invading NATO in the near future would be basically impossible. But if you have the largest contributor to NATO saying, if you don't even pay this, I don't even know if I'm going to defend you. That's how you make Article 5 seem like it's not really about collective defense, and that's the priority. The priority is the best deal you can get. And that degrades it. And so I do agree that the likelihood is low, but that's because we have worked to reinforce and strengthen these institutions. And currently people are weakening them.
Yeah, I mean, I see. Okay, look, it's sort of going into the argument you made before about, what's the best way to reduce the likelihood that Russia will engage in further military action, be it Georgia, Moldova, or the rest of Ukraine, and that is, dealing them a defeat of some kind, right? Whatever that is at this stage in the game. And I just think that what we're sort of glossing over with that is this idea that when countries decide to invade, to conduct a war, it's like a very complicated analysis. They try to calculate risk. They try to calculate, potential gain. As you mentioned before, it's sort of like that trade-off of cost benefit, right? Like, is it worth it? And I just don't see a scenario for the Russians where it's ever going to be worth it to invade Europe.
Do you think it was worth it to invade Ukraine?
I don't. I actually don't. The one argument that you could make in favor of that, where maybe I'm like, okay, I'm open to that, is that the Russians essentially looked at, and you said this before, they looked at Ukraine as like a line of demarcation, right? And it was basically the West saying, you shall not pass, right? Like, do not cross this line. Don't you dare do it. And the Russians basically said, well, we're going in. Fuck you. What are you going to do about it? And I know that that's a sort of immature kind of framing here, but the point I'm trying to make is that they've demonstrated that they're not going to allow the West to determine what the Russia can and can't do with its military. And I would say that in that sense, it might be worth it because now we have to negotiate with the Russians more seriously. We have to consider, hey, they might actually do this. Maybe this Putin guy's crazy enough to send the army in, and we need to consider that in our analysis here. I still think it was a mistake because that's led to Finland joining NATO. That's led to Europe, having way less comfortable time dealing with Russians at all and having economic ties to Russia, such that, I think the Nord Stream sabotage happened partially with the consent of the European countries themselves. So they're willing to break their energy link with Russia. That's how afraid of Russia they are, or upset they are about this, both things, So yeah, I do think it was a mistake for the Russians to have done this. I think that was basically your question. Sorry, I got carried away with the answer.
No, it's fine. I get carried away all the time. I get lost in my own thoughts. But if it was a mistake and they still made that calculation, this is why most people, and me included, thought it was unlikely. I think the day before, my calculation was 55% chance they don't go in, 45% chance they do. The thing that scared me was the blood bags, because you don't deploy blood bags on the border unless somebody's going to be bleeding. And that was when I was like, man, this is probably not training, or this might actually not be training. But we thought in the whole world, and your analysis still is, that it was a bad decision to invade, that it was not a good decision. So my point is that we might calculate from our perspective here sitting in the West, thinking that, thinking about the Russians, how we think about ourselves and what we want, that no, they wouldn't invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They wouldn't try to close the gap with Kaliningrad, try to absorb these states quickly to try to test NATO or see. They wouldn't attempt that because that'd be too crazy. It'd be crossing this red line. And to some extent, I agree that there's a lot of motivations against that. But if they were crazy enough to not only invade Ukraine once, but invade Ukraine twice, and on the second time, doing it with as few troops as they did, I mean, that was a real bad calculation on their part. If they would have invaded Ukraine with triple the troops that they had at the start, this war could have maybe gone vastly different. Maybe they wouldn't have taken Kiev, but they probably would have gotten into the city instead of just fighting in the suburbs outside of the city. But they underestimated the Ukrainians drastically. And the reason people didn't expect them to do it is because they thought it would be too painful for them, but they still made that calculation. And so if the Russians are willing to make that calculation, then I'm just not safe hoping on their good intentions or their self-preservation principle of human life, considering that I think a life, at least to the Russian government, seems a lot less valuable than in a lot of other capitals when it comes to spending it on the battlefield. I don't think that making that bet that they won't do it again is a safe one. I think we need to take the safe route after two failures of Russia policy, being the first and second invasion, not even including Georgia or Chechnya or whatever.
I'm sympathetic to that. I am. The idea that, it's a possibility, right? And we shouldn't rule it out entirely. And, we shouldn't just assume that this, that, or the other is going to happen. And that's fair. I would counter that with, Russia's determination as to whether or not they should interfere in Ukraine was based on various things. And one of them was this inherent immediate risk to their own safety. I think that's their argument. Whether we agree with it or not, I do think that is something that came into their consideration, is that, and look, I don't want to get pulled
into Ukraine, you mean?
Yeah, I think, is at the core of it.
So would that not logic equally apply to states like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, or other states that are on their border, that they would want to either make an agreement with NATO to have NATO retract from those states with pressure, or physically remove them if they thought they could get away with it? And again, in most scenarios, they wouldn't. But that's why they work to degrade the security guarantees. I mean, before they invaded Ukraine, what was it that they demanded from the West? They didn't demand to give us Kiev. They demand remove your security guarantees from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that Finland and the Baltic states are already NATO members is like a huge deterrence there.
It is.
And so I think I just leave it there. It's like there's no reason for me to.
They're in NATO, so why do you even need an army? It's just you got your.
No, I don't mean why need an army, but I think the Russians are way less likely to attack any of those countries just for that reason. And we could just leave it there. I mean, like, if they want to militarize, I am Finnish origin. I visited Finland recently.
Where?
If they want to build a long ass fucking chain link fence with barbed wire and station troops there, go ahead. If that makes you feel more secure, I have no opposition to that. But at the end of the day, I don't think the Russians, whether the Finns do that or not, if Finland's in NATO, I don't think they're going to.
This is the thing, right? It's not just about like, hey, there's option one where it's war with all of NATO, or option two, no war at all. From the Russian perspective, it's like when they manipulate the internals of a country's politics, the reason they're doing that isn't because they care about like Moldovan social justice issues. The reason they're doing that is because they want to turn Moldovan foreign policy in their direction. They want to take the foreign policy of the state and manipulate it for their interests, either by bringing Moldova into the sphere of influence or by making sure that Moldova doesn't work with the West, doesn't work with anybody that would, be opposed to their, re-entry into Eastern Europe. And so when I think about how they would go into like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, I think about things like industrial sabotage to undermine European defense production. I think about assassinations of defense companies. Like they just tried to assassinate the head of Rheinmetall like 6 or 7 months ago, and it failed. And I think about their manipulation of their politics, trying to undermine the state so they can manipulate it towards their own ends. We're hearing huge scandals right now in Romania about Georgescu and the campaign and the judges stepping in. There were scandals in Moldova about Russia literally buying people's votes, trying to stop them from joining the European Union. And so if it was just the option of invade or not invade, and that was the only foreign policy tool that Russia had at its disposal when trying to apply pressure to Europe or trying to disconnect and divide and conquer European states, then I would agree with you that like it's probably not nearly as much of a concern as I am putting out. But it's not just that. And even if it's just 10 to 20%, I don't think anybody would flip a coin or like roll a dice if there's a 20% chance the house is about to blow up from a Russian Shaheed. So I think that even if I was to ignore the other tools at their disposals, there's still enough risk that makes it, that would make us foolish to not at least take precautions. And there's other tools at their disposal that the Russians have shown themselves more than willing to use. I don't know if you saw this, but the Russians tried to do now we're waiting for more information to come out, but this just came out today about an attempted terror bombing in Ivano-Frankivsk, where they tried to recruit a 15 and 17-year-old off of Telegram, and it ended up killing the 15-year-old, the older boy. I think the younger one's still fighting. I forget which one died from the explosion, which one didn't. But they were trying to trick them into doing a terrorist attack, a suicide bombing in Ukraine. And then we've seen them try to blow up rail lines in Poland. So I think that it is true that an invasion itself right now is unlikely, but it's not the only tool they have at their disposal. And they play for the long game.
No, it's not the only tool they have at their disposal, but I also don't think that continuing the war in Ukraine is going to make the Russians less likely to utilize any of those tools. I think that, look, what we're describing here, like this information warfare in terms of interfering in the political system and assassinations and all that, I think might be, the idea that the Russians will coordinate a mass campaign of assassinations in Europe. Not even saying that's your argument, but I'd say, okay, if the concern is assassinations.
It's not even about all across Europe. You concentrate these tools in one area, like they did in Ukraine. You concentrate them, you build them up, you manipulate the politics, you divide the society.
But wait, hold on. What do you think? And are we still, like, let's focus on the Baltics and Finland for a second. There's crucial differences between those countries and Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're far more stable, far less corrupt, I think that the idea that the Russians getting involved in those places in covert ways to destabilize, it would be far less successful.
It'll be much more difficult in countries like Estonia, which is part of the reason why corrupt states are the ones that have the most difficulty dealing with the Russians. Moldova, Romania, these are not countries that have exactly high public transparency and trust issues with their government. So again, it's not, I think when we're talking about that, maybe Estonia isn't the first one to talk about when it comes to the issue of manipulating of the politic, but Romania, I mean, they're in a massive scandal right now where Georgescu, they're talking about Russian manipulation of the system to try to get Georgescu ahead. There's some talk about money payment. We really don't know. The picture's still being painted, but it's clear that the Russians were trying to interfere in the Romanian and Moldovan political system. The depths of that interference, we still don't know. But I think my general point here isn't that winning in Ukraine necessarily is going to that we need to push the Russians out of Ukraine to stop them from like manipulating the Estonian election system. My point is that if we take these systems for granted as they're just like solid, they're strong, and don't worry, now they're in NATO, we don't need to worry about it, it makes it a lot easier for them to degrade these systems and make the Article 5 and these things that are currently being degraded by political figures less strong, less powerful, easier to test. And then the Russians can make a calculation of will we be able to trade like this city in Estonia for Washington, D.C. and atomic hellfire under a Trump administration, right? And I'm not saying this is the likely outcome, But I am saying that if you're the leader of a country, you don't just get prepared for what's most likely or what would you want to happen. You have to be prepared for a pandemic that's going to infect your population and is going to hurt your people. You got to be prepared for these types of Russian ambitions, since they've clearly shown those ambitions again and again. Now, I don't think the Russians would be stupid enough to walk straight into something that would destroy them and all of Europe. But I also don't think that they're giving up these intentions.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I think, look, you shouldn't take anything as absolutely certain. Definitely. But what you do is you calculate probabilities. So in the case of America, right? Like, I don't think China is going to invade Taiwan. I don't. But I would say that that's far more likely to happen than a lot of the stuff we're describing here, at least in terms of the Baltics and Finland anyway.
Yeah.
Romania, I'm not as well informed about that as you are. I'll do my own research. Maybe we'll talk about it another time. But I just don't see an imminent military invasion into Europe or any large scale political sabotage
right now, aren't they?
Well, okay, that's part of the reason, but I don't see it happening even if the war were resolved tonight. I would say I think it's less likely for that to happen than, for example, China invading Taiwan, or North Korea nuking Seoul, or I don't know, Iran carrying out mass strikes on the U.S. military bases in the Middle East. There are lots of bad things that could potentially happen that we have to account for that seem to be far more likely than what you're describing.
I agree that right now it's an unlikely scenario, but I think that it becomes more likely the better the Russians perform in Ukraine, the more demands that they fulfill, and the more positively they react to this war. Because the way they talk about a society is not struggle just against Ukraine, it's a struggle against the collective West. Right? It is not something where you listen to the Russian nationalists. They don't just talk about stopping at even Ukraine or stopping at the cities that they've just recently conquered. They talk about it as a battle with the collective West because they want to expand past Ukraine. And so I agree that the odds of it happening right now, due to both them being distracted in Ukraine and Article 5 still not being degraded to dirt, makes it difficult for them to not only pursue it now or even pursue it in the immediate aftermath of the war. Plus, they would probably need to engage in some period of rebuilding. They would probably need to, continue to expand their armed forces, try to recover it, do some learning, because I think they've made a few mistakes in this war that they probably would want to reflect upon. But in that time, I don't think that they would abandon these goals. And the better they perform in that country, the more that they take, the further their starting point is going to be next time when they either invade Ukraine again, or God damn it, chat's crazy today. The further their starting point is going to be when they invade Ukraine, for example, across the river, which would be a huge concern for the Ukrainians, or the further they're going to be able to push their public when confronting other European states. Because I don't see Donald Trump turning around when it comes to European policy in the near future. He's a flip-flopper. He might tomorrow love Europe again, but I have a particular fear over the next 3 years because I don't know if the Russians think that Trumpism is here to stay. And from a Russian perspective, there's a window that's been opened, because if you get President Harris or President Waltz or President whoever in 4 years, they're probably going to be, at least to some degree, a Euro-Atlanticist.
No, we agree on that. And in terms of whether or not Trumpism is here to stay, a lot of that hinges on what happens domestically, how the country is doing for the average American. And, look, I'm not a Trump fan. I don't support Trump, but I actually think a lot of the stuff he's doing is bad for the average American, such that I don't think we'll have necessarily another Republican follow him, but that's projecting way into the future. So, look, what I would like to see, whoever's in the White House, is a much more pragmatic approach to the Russia question, such that, look, they're a major world power. They are a nuclear state. They have a historically kind of bad relationship with the United States. They do view us as an adversary. And so we have to deal with them diplomatically with all of that stuff in mind. And no, we shouldn't take for granted that they're never going to cross any of these red lines again. But I also think that the Russians make calculations determined on cost-benefit analysis. They stand to lose a lot, as has been demonstrated in the war in Ukraine, making a miscalculation here. And I do think that will cause some degree of pause.
Do you think
And
they
you know,
view it as a miscalculation?
I don't, you know, look, I think that it depends who you ask, but I think there are
The,
many
the leadership,
within.
like the people at the top, the real decision
I,
makers.
I don't. Okay, so like Lavrov, Putin, like people like that. I would say that if they get a majority of their their stated like whatever booty, but lack of a better way of putting it, if they get most of their war aims achieved, they'll look at it as a victory that is was met with a huge price tag, right? And I think that they will hesitate launching another war again.
Why do you think when it comes to these terms that they're putting forward, when it comes to making it so Ukraine can't defend itself, I think is clear what the terms are. Why do you think that is? And what's the possibility if those are the terms that what you're saying, Trump wants to pivot away and he wants whatever terms will end the war so he can normalize and try to pivot towards these other directions? If that's true, what motivation would the Russians have to not invade Ukraine again when it's demilitarized and with no peacekeepers in a much weaker state than it is now? Because the numbers that I remember that the Russians asked for in Istanbul was like 90,000 Ukrainian soldiers compared to the 800,000, 850,000 that are fighting now. I mean, it would be impossible for them to defend themselves.
I think it would be impossible for them to defend themselves as a conventional military, but I don't think that it would be impossible for some sort of mass insurgency or resistance movement to be launched. I think occupying a hostile country, even if they don't have a conventional military that's capable of defending, the country the same way that they do now, I think that trying to lock that down and just absorb it into Russia's borders could be, a very bloody, very violent endeavor that could, lead to a disastrous outcome for the Russians. I don't see that as being an immediate goal after the end of this conflict.
I don't know let's not just talk about like immediate goal within the 1 to 2 year frame. I'm talking 3 to 4 to 5. As long as Putin's alive and the people who would come after Putin, because Putin's not the only ones with imperial ambitions towards Ukraine. I think a lot of people have deluded themselves into thinking once Putin's gone, like, maybe we can, Russia will come back and they'll be like, this was such a mistake. I don't think that.
I agree.
That's not going to happen. There's a lot of people that believe the same things that Putin believes about Ukraine and what it means for Russia and its identity and its empire and its security. So if Ukraine is going to have this insurgency in this example, or like that's the option that they're going to basically be given at that point. Ukrainians remember like UPA when they were fighting the Soviets, like 45 to 53. And a lot of Soviets were killed. Actually, more Soviets than Ukrainian rebels actually died during that period. So they were significantly, effective in resisting them, but they lost. People don't sing Batko Nash Bandera as the Ukrainian national anthem. Bandera didn't succeed. The UPA did not succeed. They resisted for a bit, but by 53, 54, 55, they were gone. And the Soviets had taken over all of Ukraine. And so I think that Putin, and I know this is me doing a little bit of, I don't want to do like, this, I hate it when these news stations bring on people like to read people's body language, like, oh, they leaned forward, so I think that indicates they're lying. And I don't want to do too much psychological profile analysis, but Putin is very, very, he's like a Redditor about history. I don't know how to say this politically correct, but he's super focused on it in a way that has certain spectrum qualities, right? And so when I listen to him talk about like Yaroslav's horse taking a shit in Kiev, which is why Russia deserves to have Ukraine, and I think about all that historical nonsense, it wouldn't be hard for me to see from Putin's perspective, yeah, we'll have an UPA, we'll have some Bandera bandits in the mountainside or whatever, but, with time and effort, we'll take them out. And hey, it took a lot less manpower to put down those Ukrainian rebels back in the day than it did to put down this Ukrainian armed forces. Once the Russians haven't gotten into the occupation of the whole country yet. Once you do that, yes, mass resistance is difficult, but it takes a lot more casualties on the Ukrainians, and a lot of those, I don't think most Ukrainians would want to fight a 20, 30-year guerrilla war, and I think the Russians might have the hubris to believe that they could put it down, like they did before.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the context is very different. You know, post World War II, Soviet Union,
Or
Ukrainian
even
resistance.
World War One, Soviet Union, when they invaded and they put down the Ukrainian resistance. It happened twice in 20 years.
Yeah, I'd say the context is even more different there. I think the present context is such that, you know, I would say sentiment towards Russia in West Ukraine is probably at a historically low, you know, level. Like I would say that there's probably, I don't know, would you you're over there. Would you agree that like there's probably a pretty consistent, vehement hatred and distrust of Russia entirely?
Across most of Ukraine that I've been, yes. And even the ones that, like, the closest I'll get in the other way, it's like I hate them both is the closest I can get in like, like I just live here in my village. That's the closest I can find to something that's sympathetic.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that is the outcome of this war. That's a big reason why I'd say it was a mistake for the Russians. But I also think that that plays into the reality of Russia attempting to occupy the rest of that country. I mean, I think there would be fiercer, much more consistent, persistent resistance against a Russian occupation than anything we had seen in history.
But let's say that's what you think, right? And I agree that the resistance would probably be very strong, especially since a lot of those people would probably be decommissioned soldiers who fought in Ukraine for 2 years on the front line. And remember how all those we disarmed all the Baathists, and then they were like, well,
Right.
we're just gonna go out and fight now. And I'd assume that there'd be some not to say that they're like the Baathists, but there'd be some equivalent there in Western Ukraine. But from the Russian perspective, they've been able to, again, this is not just about how we would view it or how the Ukraine, it's how the Russians would view it, because they're the ones making the decision to invade again. And from the Russian perspective, they fought the entire West in all of its capital, all of its weapons, fighting some Ukrainian rebels that no longer have the means. They no longer have the artillery guns. They no longer have the tanks. They no longer have all of the drones or all the stuff that we've now demilitarized them of post agreement. If we're going to, we're talking about this in this framework, it's going to be a much easier fight for them, not only initially take over the country, but the type of weapons that they're going to be dealing with after. There'll be assassinations. There'll be car bombings. I've talked about this before. It would make the Troubles look like, you stubbed your toe a bit. But at the end of the day, it's going to be less costly for the Russians than the first wave of the war. It's going to mean less personnel being killed. It's probably going to mean a lot more Ukrainians being killed. And there's a lot more Russians than there are Ukrainians. And so switching that casualty figure, so it's 2 to 3 Russians dying to 1 Ukrainian, switching it over to 5 Ukrainians for every Russian, because it's not like we've seen them pay particular attention to preventing civilian casualties in this war. I can't confidently make the assertion that the Russians would eventually just feel so drained that they would have to leave the country, or that they wouldn't feel that at the very least they'd be willing to drag this out for a decade or two in order to see if they could wrangle it into submission, which would mean many, 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 many more dead than continuing this war for another year, waiting for a better position.
Yeah, I mean, look, it could just be a thing where both of us have a different view of what would happen, and it's kind of just unfalsifiable, right? Like I happen to think that the Russians attempting to occupy Ukraine would be a major catastrophic mistake. They would be met with constant resistance for years and years and years, insurgencies, etc. It's not just the level, it's just not just the number of Russian soldiers dying in such an insurgency. It's the amount of resources that would have to be allocated.
Do you think it would be more or less than now?
I don't know. I mean, I would think it would be more than the Russians would like to spend, even if it is less than now. And I also think that it's hard to imagine Russia, simultaneously wanting to annex the rest of Ukraine and hold on to it in spite of this fierce resistance, and also wanting to potentially invade Moldova, and also wanting to potentially invade Georgia, and also wanting to project power into West Africa and the Middle East. I think that there is something to the idea that they'll be stretched way too thin at that point, and it's a matter of priorities, right?
Let me reinforce you for a bit here, and I can talk a little bit longer because this has gone a bit longer than I wanted, but
as soon as you're done, it's fine.
This has been a generally good faith conversation, so I'm entertaining it more. Where was? Oh yeah, Assad. Assad's collapse, I think, shows to some extent that the Russians do not have the resources they wish they had. Because when Assad was under pressure, the Russians did engage in an air campaign, but I don't know if you followed the Syrian civil war back when the Russians were really bombing them. It was nothing like they used to. They didn't have the air power, they didn't have the manpower, and so they did everything they could with what they had there to save Assad. They just failed. And then not only did they failed spectacularly. Assad fell.
They collapsed in a week.
Yeah, they did what they wanted to do in Ukraine, right? That's what happened from the Syrian rebels' perspective. And so there is an extent of them being stretched too far, but I would also say that if you watch the fall of Assad, that could also be leveraged from the American and Ukrainian perspective. If anything, it only reinforces the idea that the Russians have so many interests, so many other places. That port in Syria, without it, how do they connect to Africa? They have to go all the way to Khalifa Haftar in Libya if they're going to have an intermediary point between them and all of their, mercenary work that they're doing in Africa, their Africa Corps, which is, I don't know why they chose that name. They probably could have chose something different than the Africa Corps, but that's what they call it. That to me shows that they are under heavy pressure, that they don't have resources to just put over here and put over there. And it reinforces to me that Ukraine is in a much stronger negotiating position than many people seem to suggest. And again, would leave me with a position of, it's not that we can't negotiate with them. They just need to be realistic. And if they don't act realistic, then we have to make conditions on the ground that will make them behave realistically.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, but I think what you're saying is, it's kind of like, you sort of said as much. It's like, it's sort of lending to my argument to some extent that,
I said, let me reinforce you. I said that at the start.
Right. And that's what it becomes is like, it's a matter of priorities for Russia. What should Russia's priorities be? Should it be, okay, we need to annex all of Ukraine because what? Well, it will secure us from potential NATO invasion. I don't think that's that likely. I mean, it'll prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Well, looks like we might get that anyway.
First time though, in 2022, wouldn't all this logic apply during the start of the invasion?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I thought the invasion was probably a bad idea to begin with, was the fact that Russia, I don't think, needed to do this to get any of the things that they wanted. I think the main thing that they wanted was Ukraine not to join NATO. I don't think it was necessary for them to invade to do that.
Do you think that's the main thing they wanted?
Yeah, I would say that was agenda item number one. For sure. And then, are there, like, I would say second to that would probably be asserting themselves as a world power. Past that, I mean, I don't know, territory, like just holding on to territory.
Genuine question. What makes you think, because this is, it's very, and I enjoy trying to look through the world through other people's eyes, but it's very, very hard. What makes you think that out of all the things that Putin talked about when it comes to like history and Yaroslav or, resources or whatever it is, or, this talk of we rebuilt Ukraine after World War II, out of everything, that NATO is definitely number one. What makes you come to that?
Because I think when world leaders and leaders of a country at war speak about history and all of this very nationalistic stuff, I think that essentially is just propaganda. It's just saying, like, this is why we have to do this because of our historical link to Ukraine and blah, blah. It's the same kind of stuff Bush would say about, like, the war on terror being like a moral war and, spiritual war and all these allusions to like a greater meaning. I don't think it's ever really about that, maybe that's super cynical and I'm thinking way too pragmatically. And maybe Putin, you're right, is more of like this, like as you put it, sort of Reddit brained kind of thinking person of like, oh, well, this is our historic region. And, because of this obscure historical link between blah, 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 but I just happen to think that when world leaders say that stuff, whether they believe it or not, it's really for propaganda purposes, first and foremost. And second of all, even if they believe that, there's your personal desires, right, and your personal beliefs about the world and history and what's right and what's wrong and where the borders should be and all of that stuff. And then there's the pragmatic hard reality, right? And the pragmatic hard reality is Ukraine and Russia are separate countries, right? And West Ukraine especially, but I think all of Ukraine really, doesn't necessarily want to be part of Russia or even Russia's sphere of influence necessarily, depending on who you ask. So I think it really came down to this is an immediate cause for concern because the potential that Ukraine could join NATO, right? And they've shown an interest. There seems to be a mutual interest to some extent. Let's avoid this entirely. And also, Russia having this desire to be respected as a world power. I do think there's personal. One thing that you didn't mention either, there is this idea, I think, of like Ukraine's link to U.S. politics and Ukraine's link specifically to the Biden administration. Dude, I'm not going to get into the whole laptop thing, whatever, super conspiracy shit. But there was a link between, I think, the Biden and the. Say it again.
Do you believe that like Biden supported Ukraine because of his son?
No, I think that factored into Putin's decision making. I do.
I don't see anything on the Hunter Biden stuff, honestly. I just find it hard to believe with so many gigantic issues that could be motivating it, that Hunter Biden's laptop, which didn't really have much of an impact at all, at least I think I just don't see it. Now if you got something you could send me that would make me see it, maybe I'll change my mind.
I don't. No, I don't. And look, my argument doesn't even hinge on that. I'm just trying to list all of the possible reasons that come before the historical claim of that Russia has over Ukraine.
Maybe it's because I'm a little less cynical. I don't know. But I do believe that world leaders have ideology and that they do dictate some of their decision making because they're human beings as ideology, especially if, and it's even more important, if that individual has outsized influence on the politics. So it isn't like, for example, there's a few congressmen with this ideology and a few others with a different ideology, but it's one person who generally controls the system because it's a dictatorship. So I would say that if Putin was ideological, it probably would have more of an impact on Russia than if a few congressmen or even the president of the United States was ideological, because he has less checks on himself. Yeah? Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So for me, when I listen to Putin talk about, Russian history and stuff, it could be that it's just chauvinistic chest beating that he's putting out there for his base so he can rile them up in order to get them in support of the war and make them think that their struggle today is somehow connected to grandpapa, and so they're continuing this family, whatever that is. It could be that. It could also be that when Putin sits down and actually takes the time to write these essays, which I don't see most presidents like sitting down and actually doing that. It's very strange to see a president actually, I released an essay today, want to see it? I see that from staffers sometimes, but not presidents. And he goes into detail about how he thinks it's an extension of Russia, how he thinks the Ukrainian language is basically just like a dialect of Russian. And I do think from how much he talks about it, how deeply he talks about it, and how often he'll divert into it, that he does believe it to some extent. Now, maybe it's kind of, he's walking back from his conclusion that there's strategic reasons for him to be interested in Ukraine. And so he's convinced himself that this is also part of some historical crusade. But we can't calculate that because you don't know what came first, chicken or the egg. No idea. Either way, I do think to some extent that propaganda, you can call it, but I would say ideology plays into world leaders' decision making. I would also say that if it was primarily motivated by NATO membership, they would have taken that 30-day ceasefire option like right off the bat. They would have said, yes, this 30-day ceasefire, we already have no NATO membership, we already have no US troops in Ukraine, we already have all this, we can end the war now, this is so destructive for our country, so painful for our country, let's take it. If this is our primary concern, let's take it now, then risk for us to gas ourselves out and avoid it in the future. Now, I do think it's a motivation. The reason I don't think it's the primary motivation is I think we would have seen more eagerness to jump at this if it was, and they've just told by the president, you can have your main goal. There you go, you can have your main goal. And their reaction is, give me a non-starter? It could be a negotiating tactic, or it could be a sign that it is a factor, just maybe not the primary motivating one. I'll also say, the Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO in 2014 or in 2022. Hungary, Germany, France, Spain, all these countries, especially the Hungarians, the Turks, didn't want Ukraine in NATO. And without getting them on board, they were not going to join NATO.
Yeah, well, you said a few things there, but the one thing at the end I think it was 2021, wasn't it? Where I think it was. So I know that there was an Atlantic Council paper basically saying that it was a few Atlantic Council papers published that year about an inevitable war between Russia and Ukraine. And there was a significant amount of censorship of like Russian media within Ukraine. It seemed like, when Zelensky came to power initially, he came to power on a platform of peace. And it seems that those tides were turning prior to the war starting. So it wasn't like it came totally out of nowhere either. But I do want to go back to just the whole ideology thing. Yeah, of course. I mean, world leaders have ideology and ideological views. I just don't think that they always show their cards or that we can always infer their exact ideological views just from the things they say, because they understand when they speak publicly the weight and gravity of their words. And so therefore, everything they say publicly serves a purpose, right? And what would the purpose be of Putin hashing out this whole thesis, be it an essay or a speech or an interview with Tucker fucking Carlson, where he says all of these different things about Russia's historic claim to Ukraine? I think it's ultimately to justify the invasion that is being initiated because of this fear of Ukraine joining NATO. And the reason Putin can't acknowledge that openly is because that's an open admission that he's he's acting from a place of insecurity and fear and weakness. And that's something that, definitely Russian leadership is against. I think most world leaders are against.
I think they've talked pretty openly that NATO is aggressing upon them, that we're being aggressed upon by NATO, and that. So I think you can say that you're being attacked without doing it from a position of weakness, right? You could say like NATO's attacking us through Ukraine, and so that's why we had to fight, and we're defending our. I think you could address that directly while also not doing it from a position of weakness. But I understand what you're saying, that he's talking to the public. Are you really gonna take this conniving KGB like smart guy at his face when he's saying this to the public when it's meant for the public? And I understand that, but these messages have been so consistent and they've been so I've heard these themes throughout the years. And I've also remember hearing Putin in the early 2000s saying he didn't care if Ukraine joined NATO. And so when I remember that and I think about where Putin is now maybe that was bullshit just to try to, kiss up to the West.
Cozy up to the West.
Cozy up to the West to some extent. But it does leave me with some belief that if Ukraine could not join NATO, let's say it was possible, there was a thing in the NATO constitution that says everyone can join but Ukraine, because they stink and they put too much cream, they put too much sour cream on everything, and it's just whatever, right? They put sour cream on everything. Half their sushi is just sour cream. Did you know outside of Japan, Ukraine consumes the most sushi per capita? Interesting.
I had no idea. No,
but it's everywhere, and most of it's not good. Fuck, I lost myself because of the Ukrainian sushi.
I wouldn't want Ukrainian sushi, I gotta be honest.
I remember I was maybe 15 miles from the front, and I went to this place. It was a burger place, and they were serving sushi, and it had crab on it, and it said crab sushi. And I'm a Marylander, right? I love Maryland. I love crab. My favorite food's crab cakes. I'm a boy of the Chesapeake, right? And so I see crab anywhere outside of Maryland, I'm like, oh, thank God, I miss my crab. And so I order it, and every time it's fake crab. But you want to know what it was worse? They took gold flakes, and we're 15 miles from the front. They're sprinkling gold flakes on crab sushi to put luxury item to add 50 hryvnias to the price tag. It was terrible. I couldn't even finish it. Horrible,
dude. I'm a New Yorker. I'm spoiled with all food, but having been to Eastern Europe before, they're not known for their food for a reason anyway. I can't imagine Ukrainian sushi. Sorry, that was clearly the worst thing that could have happened to you.
That was the worst thing that happened to me, honestly. They can take my leg, just don't take my crabs. But let's say they didn't allow Ukraine into NATO, and they were just not allowed to join, and they were not allowed to send support, just no support for Ukraine from the West. Do you think, knowing that Ukraine has no allies, has no support, is this truly neutral state? Do you think in that history of events today, if we did that, Russia wouldn't invade them? That they would be like, you know what? We can leave them be now. They can do whatever they want. They can have democracy. They don't need to be corrupt. They can do whatever they want because no NATO membership, no Western involvement.
Okay, so I actually think that Ukraine's security and a lot of countries' securities really depend upon Russia's relationship with the West and the United States as a whole. And I think that we would both probably agree that that really broke down during the Syrian civil war, right? We both supported basically two opposite sides, and there were multiple sides in that conflict. But I think that that really was the beginning of the end in terms of Ukraine's real guarantee of security, regardless of its status. But I do think that that was at least part of the calculus when it came to Putin's fear of Ukraine being absorbed into NATO, because the thinking being, okay, the world chessboard has been aligned in such a way that we're now, in this, we have this adversarial relationship with the West once again, as we have had historically. And where are the potential, weak spots for us? Well, one of them is clearly Ukraine, right? There's like a heavy anti-Russia sentiment there anyway. It's also a politically fragile country, highly corrupt, prone to, being preyed upon by NGOs. And, there's also a legitimate, as I said before, distrust of Russia. It's not infeasible that this country could not only join NATO, but if there were a conflict between us and the West, it would probably be through Ukraine. I think that was their thinking. So, in a different scenario where Ukraine is truly neutral, I don't know, Yanukovych is never overthrown, Maidan never happened. I don't know. I mean, I would say it's far less likely, but it would still be a possibility if we had an adversarial relationship with Russia as we do now, and as we have had since the Syrian civil war.
I believe that if there was no NATO, there was no Western security involvement, I'm sure there'd still be some trade. Obviously, I don't think anybody's expecting Ukraine to be like, we can't trade with Europe, we can only trade with Russia. Like no ridiculous nonsense. But if we had this, the normal nation state trading with other nation states, my immediate reaction would not necessarily be like, oh, well, now Russia feels so secure, so they wouldn't invade. From Putin's perspective, I mean, I could see it as, oh, this is so much easier. Oh my gosh, it would be easier to invade them. There's no foreign support. There's no alliance structure. I believe that Ukraine basically can only exist as either an extension of us or otherwise. And the thing that started this all off in 2014 was the economic coercion of the Ukrainian state by the Russian government, because they were thinking of entering an association agreement with the European Union. There was not NATO on the table. There was no discussion of NATO in this. This was a promise that Yanukovych made on the campaign trail to enter this association agreement. And Russia still said, no, you need to enter our association agreement with our economic arrangement. And if you don't, we're going to cut off 50% of our trade. And now Russia's a major trading partner for Ukraine. But also, and this is the kicker, Yanukovych's base of support comes from Eastern Ukraine, where there's a lot more Russian speakers. And they like Yanukovych for a few reasons, not because he was stealing hats off the rack, which, by the way, that's the only cool thing about him, is that he used to steal hats off the rack and run away. It's the only thing that qualifies him to be president in my mind. But it's because those people have an economic relationship with Russia over the border. And they don't want the border to be closed off when they go across the border for trade, or they go across the border for work, or they do this and do that. And so that economic threat to Ukraine was substantial, not only to Ukraine, but specifically to his power base. And so he pulled out in the middle of the night. If Russia is willing to do this when NATO's not on the table, I don't know if the removal from NATO from this equation is really going to change their thinking. I do think, at least from Putin's perspective, maybe a different Russian government, maybe a different timeline, at this point, that they would still want to take on Ukraine, at least as some sort of proxy from Moscow. They don't want it to be a sovereign, separate entity making agreements with others that could be made with them.
I mean, maybe, I think part of what factors into that is that if Ukraine is economically integrated into a Europe that is hostile towards Russia, or Russia feels is hostile towards them, or they're on opposite ends of the spectrum due to other geopolitical, concerns, I think then it becomes a major problem versus a minor problem if Ukraine wants to be integrated into Europe. I do think that there are other countries on Russia's border that, yes, maybe in theory a threat of being invaded by Russia, but Russia also wants, as part of its sphere of influence, wants an economic alignment with to some extent, will probably have an economic relationship with, because Russia produces oil and lots of things lots of countries might want. But Russia will not have an aggressive stance with if they have a friendly relationship with the West, because Russia doesn't view those countries as potentially being a threat the same way Ukraine does. Ukraine is, and I think that some of that is part of the history of Ukraine, part of the history of Ukraine and Russia's relationship historically, and the adversarial aspects to that. I don't know. It's like every country's different. Everything, it's complicated. But I guess I'm willing to concede that there is a scenario where everybody is being perfectly kind to Russia and they still invade. I suppose that's hypothetically true, but I know that that's not the reality. The reality is Russia did intervene in Ukraine because they were concerned about primarily NATO membership. And,
Well, you said you don't know that. You said you think that. You think that was their main motivation because you can't read into their intentions. I think it was a motivation.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Right.
That I'm pretty confident in saying, but no, I don't know 100%.
Now, this is an experiment that no nation state will ever engage in. No nation state's going to say, look, we're going to get rid of all of our things that could be used as leverage against you, so you feel so comfortable that you'll leave us alone. No nation state will ever make that decision, because that's you have to have a certain amount of naivete and a certain amount of trust in Russia that they have not earned, right? And I don't think they've earned it, and so they're not going to get it. And I think as long as there is uncertainty about the nation states' intentions, nation states are going to arm themselves. This is kind of like, basic IR. As long as if you see another country building up artillery, is it for them to protect their villages or to bomb yours? And so that uncertainty is always going to be there for Russia, whether or not NATO was created, whether or not NATO was not created. And before the creation of NATO, when Europe was divided into different blocks, where the Germans had their own block and the French had their own block and the Habsburgs had their own block, and they were competing, the Russians, when NATO was not that ally, they would aggressively try to invade westward, expand westward to get geographical barriers in places like Ukraine, the mountains, which would allow them a better defense than they would otherwise get if they just had a straight shot through a bunch of farm fields to Moscow, as a certain Wagner leader showed the vulnerability of. So I think that without NATO membership, and if we were to keep either the Europe of before post-World War II, World War I era Europe of these different imperial powers conflicting against each other, or some kumbaya, we're all neutral states in Europe, we're all together, I am not confident enough in Russia that they're going to change their behavior because they have less uncertainty about the intentions of Europe. And even if we were to create, and again, we're creating a scenario that could never happen because no state's ever going to disarm themselves in that way or not act in collective defense against the largest country in all of humanity.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I am sympathetic. I think I made that clear. And I think we are kind of maybe sort of circling the drain a little here, because I feel like I'm arriving back at the same point again.
But it's a natural conclusion. You mean we're naturally concluding?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And just to finish the idea, or finish the point, no, there's no guarantee of anything, and there's no certainty that X will happen. It's a matter of probabilities, and sometimes we miscalculate those probabilities, as I did about Russia initially invading, and you did as well. And I don't know, look, I just know
if
that
I overcorrected and you undercorrected, there's going to be neither of us. There's going to be someone between us.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, look, I just know that at this stage in the game, there's been a significant number of people dead, a lot of money spent. The war has been catastrophic. I think it was a mistake for Russia to launch the invasion. I think it was a mistake for us to fund Ukraine's defense to this level. I think that, okay, what's done is done. Now, how do we clean up the mess? And I think the best way of doing that is not to continue to fund the war effort. But, at the end of the day, I get what you're saying about there's always a potential threat for this, that, and the other, and we need to account for that. And it's a reality of nation states in the 21st century. But I don't know. I happen to believe it's less likely than you think that the Russians will continue on a march through Ukraine, let alone the rest of Europe. But look, we're going on 3 hours, I think, almost.
Two and a half, I think. Or wait, we started
Yeah,
at 6:30. It's yeah, I think
almost
it's
9:30.
been 2 hours at least.
Yeah, my stream clock says 3:09, and I started with you 15 minutes after I started my stream. But this is more than enough content I need for radio. So I appreciate that. And look, man, I mean, again, I just want to make one final statement, and then I'll let you kind of do a closer here.
Sure.
But I look. I'm glad you pretty much agreed with me that there is such a thing as a principled opposition to the war. And I honestly just want to tell your audience, that's been my primary objective from the start, is to try and make sure that, hey, if people are dying here, I want to make sure they're dying for a justifiable reason, and that not all contradictions of the official narrative have to be Russian propaganda. We can have a critical analysis of this narrative. And ideally, I think debates on Twitch, maybe you disagree because people like the fireworks, right? But ideally, debates should be something more akin to what we're having now. Like an open discussion, everybody has time to hash out their thoughts, and, whatever, the audience will maybe not change their mind at all, but at least it'll open up all of us to maybe even just strengthen our own positions. I don't know. So anyway, what do you have to say to finish us out here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was more productive than the panel for sure. I think we were able to get into more detail because we'd pivot away so quickly on the panel environment because what happened is somebody runs into a question that somebody doesn't want to answer, and so what happens is pivot, and then you're away from the topic initially. Like we went from like, how do we know the Russians won't invade again? And it got all the way down to Euromaidan. But here, we kind of hold each other more to account, and we don't have as much necessity for performance. So I do prefer conversations like this, even if the audience doesn't necessarily prefer it. As for like closing statements, look, I understand that certainty is expensive and security is expensive. It costs lives, it costs money, it costs possibly even economic growth when it comes to who you can and cannot trade with. But I think that our security is our main priority of the state, both for the Ukrainians and both for the Europeans. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians certainly cannot afford much more uncertainty. If they're going to have spent 3 years of bleeding and dying in the mud on top of a decade of occupation and semi-frozen conflict in the Donbass, while facing the possibility of American decoupling from Europe, they need to take the situation seriously. And it can't be something that's left up to chance. And that means that making sure that Ukraine gets a deal that will give them the best chance to not only avoid a war in the future, but if one was to start again, that they'd be able to defend themselves. That means Ukraine has an armed forces that is allowed to defend themselves if they invade again. It means Ukraine isn't giving up territory across the Dnieper River that would allow the Russians a straight shot to the capital. It means the Ukrainians having some version of a just peace that they're allowed to live with, and they don't feel so outraged and so furious at their destitution and occupation that they start putting explosives in cars and starting years and years of generational trauma that's going to come from the violence of the Ukrainian versions of the Troubles. I don't want to keep going back to a war zone. I want to go back to a Ukraine and chill and trip in the Carpathian Mountains with my buddies. That's what I want to do. But I also don't want to feel good about myself, to feel like as an American that our country had come in and swooped the day and we forced terms to stop the violence now, pat ourselves back on the back, turn off the TV, and we just Coney 2012 Ukraine. We just say, yay, we saved the day. We walk away. Russians invade again in 3 years. And Coney's still out there being a warlord. Russians still invading Ukraine. And so I want a just peace. I want a solid peace. And I want one where Ukrainians can be certain that their kids are not going to have to pick up a rifle and that we're not going to be in Europe fighting over Article 5. And I think that the best way to do that is to invest in a strong peace, not a conciliatory surrender, which I believe right now is what the Russians are still demanding, even when offered that 30-day ceasefire.
All right. Well, one thing's for sure, we all know your view on it, and I do appreciate the time, man. I know you got other content you could be making, whatever, and maybe we'll encounter one another on a future panel or some other format, or even another 1v1.
You'll be in Wagner. We'll meet each other on the battlefield. Hey, how's it going, buddy, dude? Oh, it's been forever. Be crazy.
For the record, I would have preferred Prigozhin to be in charge of Russia over Putin, but that's a whole separate discussion. Yeah. Well, I always thought, I don't know how you think about this. I always thought he had more respect for the Ukrainians, you know, as a foe. You know, maybe it's because he was on the ground there. You know, I thought Wagner carried out plenty of war crimes and all that stuff. I obviously don't advocate for that, but I think Prigozhin looked at the brutality of the war. He had respect for the Ukrainians, and I think his frustration with the Russian military brass was such that, hey, we should probably, you know, fucking stop this and put an end to it and figure out a peaceful resolution here of some kind. And you know, I mean, it would have been interesting had they succeeded in that coup.
I feel like on one angle, because it's like what you said with public statements before, you would have to believe that the show that Prigozhin was putting on was his real show, that he cares so much about his boys out there fighting and dying, and he did develop a cult of personality. Like, this is the one guy that'll stand up for us infantrymen on the front line. That's why so many men were willing to take that risk and turn their guns on. I mean, think about that. I mean, like 3,000 men against an army of 1 million marching towards the capital. You have to really believe in a guy to do something like that. So I can't, like, 100% believe that, like, I can believe that he understood the war's brutality better, but I don't know if I believe that his solution would be ending the war. Definitely, since a lot of the people who liked Wagner are some of the most die-hard Russian nationalists available. So the people he could pull from, the ones with complaints of the war, usually the complaints I hear aren't like, oh, let's end this, and it's, God, we're fighting this so shit. Why aren't we fighting this better? Why aren't we using this? Why aren't we using that? Why do we have spending monies on this repair nonsense, repairing this road when it could be on this bomb or whatever? So I don't know if the critique would have led to him ending the war or just conducting it in a different manner. Either way, I think it would have been a wake-up call for the Russian public and a way for them maybe to think, maybe we should pull back a bit, but he decided that he would rather die in a plane crash than die in a blaze of glory. He should have, look, life is about many things. It's about how it starts and about how it ends is, I think, two of the most important parts. And how it ends is so important. How you close that chapter. I'd much rather die in a blaze of glory in the Kremlin, you know, fighting off these dudes coming in and etch myself by force into the history books than, like, spiral out pissing myself in an airplane crashing into the countryside, which is how I went. So next time that tries it, just, go all in, go big, go home.
Yeah, or at the very least, don't take advice from Lukashenko. I don't know. But, okay, good discussion, man. Appreciate the time, and maybe we'll talk again soon.
Okay, you have a good one, man. Bye-bye. My goodness. Long conversation. Oh, shit, this has been 3 hours. He was right. It was not 2 hours. It was 3 hours. Oh, my God. Oh, my goodness.